welcome to Varn Blogging here with A.J.A. Woods, who is a PhD holder from the Center of the Study of Critical Theory and Criticism at Western University, Canada. You're currently living back in your, I'm assuming, home country of England.
Mm-hmm.
I will not let my anti-English bias influence our conversation today.
Indeed, don't worry. I'll let my bias, my anti-English bias, influence it there.
Well, it's one of the stranger bits of solidarity I tend to have with English leftists, is we both don't like England. Mine is purely abstract, actually.
Mm-hmm.
It comes from, I think it honestly comes from the left of 20 years ago, which was so dominated by British Trotskyist organizations that had filled in the niche for the Maoist and old Trotskyist ones in America. Mostly, they didn't really die, but they were like just a bunch of 70-year-olds by the end of the 1980s. I'm going to preface this because I think this conversation might be a little bit more informal than maybe people are used to with you. I don't know, people are used to me. I just talk. But A.J.A. and I know each other, which I did not realize. We met in Boise, I guess almost 8 years ago.
8 years ago, yeah. It's coming up to the decade. Yeah.
And you reminded me when I reached out to you to ask you on the show that we had a conversation about the topics of your book. We are going to plug it. The Cultural Marxist Conspiracy: Why the Right Blames the Frankfurt School for the Decline of the West. Although even at the time I was already complaining to you about people not being able to tell the difference between right-wing conspiracies about the Frankfurt School and left-wing criticisms of the Frankfurt School. And I say this as a person who people will probably accuse of splitting the baby on Gabriel Rockhill's book, for example. But I knew about most of the relations to the OSS and whatnot in the book. What I didn't know from the Rockhill book was how much the State Department was involved with Marcuse in particular, and that is pretty well documented in his book. So, when I talk about people on the left using cultural Marxist conspiracy theories, I am not necessarily implicating Gabriel Rockhill, but I am implicating a lot of his fans.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean, I do find that. I mean, I come on to like a number of Twitter exchanges talking about the Frankfurt School or Marcuse. I just find that a lot of kind of Rockhill stands are totally sort of illiterate about what was going on historically at the time, not only just in the left more broadly, like in the world, but also just like in the United States, where a lot of the accusations about Marcuse being much more implicated in the CIA came from.
Yeah, well, this is interesting because you and I have talked about cultural Marxism before, and in fact, way back in the day, I think I recorded this episode more than a decade ago. I was sitting down with the Moke Sahu and recorded an episode where I responded to a Paul Gottfried article on what cultural Marxism was, and then went through the history and mentioned people like William S. Lind and the radical traditionalist movement. And that was also back before everybody and their brother knew that Richard Spencer wrote his master's thesis on Adorno, although I knew that. Because I talked to Spencer about it once before he got famous. But
do you remember what he wrote in the master's thesis? Because I remember trying to access it once, but I had no luck with it.
not a ton. I mean, it's basically a smarter version of cultural Marxist theory. And he gets it from Paul Gottfried, who was, of course, Marcuse's student. So while Spencer was writing on Adorno, Gottfried was writing a lot of Marcuse, and Gottfried's been interesting. I believe he comes up in your book, but not. Not,
bits and pieces largely, because I mean, like him and Lind have had multiple disagreements over the years because they're close friends, and they often have the argument about whether like political correctness is Marxism or not, really, because in like The Strange Death of Marxism, Paul Gottfried is more along the lines of like, well, the Frankfurt School are bad, but they're liberals, but then they're not Marxists. And whereas Lind is much more adamant that you should really call the Frankfurt School Marxists, because many Americans will then be more turned off by political correctness.
But it's interesting that even Lind basically thinks that is a public relations issue, not an issue of facticity. When I first encountered these cultural Marxist conspiracies on the left were weirdly people around what is now the Revolutionary Communist Party or the Revolutionary Communist International, what used to be the International Marxist Tendency, and that is the tendency of the inheritors of Ted Grant and really Alan Woods to also use cultural Marxist conspiracies around the Frankfurt School to blame them for postmodernism, which they then blame for the degeneration of left-wing thought. Now, from my perspective, this is all backwards. If you're going to complain about the degeneration of left-wing thought, you have to complain about the degeneration of left-wing conditions, not like like these theorists just poison the well. And if I have a critique of Rockhill, it's that he over concludes that the problems of Western Marxism come from a bunch of academics. And I'm like, I'm not sure how actually influential Marcuse was on sectarian Marxism outside of the SDS. He was influential on the SDS, though.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was going to say that. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, it depends on which faction you are kind of talking about as well, because even the Weather Underground, the influence there is more like. The influence there is obviously more like we can't organize within, you know, sort of the industrial American working class, because they're compromised, and also the institutions like sort of trade unions are no longer going to be so radical because they're so complicit with imperialism. And what you get when you look at the sort of more Marcuse influenced segments of SDS is actually a position about the possibility for revolution in the United States. It's actually quite similar to Rockhill, because it's almost sort of quite equivalent to like the labor aristocracy thesis.
Yeah, this is, I guess this kind of brings us, we kind of have to tell a story here before I go off on my connections to this, because when you and I first talked about this, we talked about the fact that I was in the circles of these people. I was not a member of the alt-right, but I was a member of its paleo-conservative / paleo-libertarian predecessor, and was freaked out when I started seeing the radical traditionalist movement and the paleo-conservative movement blending on the internet. And I saw this 10 years before anyone was talking about it. So there was a spate of books after the first Trump election about the alt-right. And I found that most of them, including one that I was partially responsible for publishing, which was Kill All Normies by Angela Nagel, which I even critiqued at the time, seemed to treat this stuff as having no history, that it just emerged from internet forums, in the late aughts, early aught teens. And I'm like, no, this has been going on for 4 decades, and there's been an active attempt to build both a conspiracy culture that feeds into it, and also like a grand theory that the paleoconservatives in particular had this weird shadow respect for classical Marxism, although they hated it. And the smarter ones, with the people who were often influential at things like Talkie Mag and the American Conservative, not Breitbart, which is really where the stuff takes off, would talk about Marxism in this weird, like, wasn't things better before the cultural Marxists took away our real enemy, which was a better enemy? And you would like get this weird degeneration. And the other thing you would get, and this is interesting because Trumpism has kind of confounded these tendencies, was these people also would tie this into Trotskyism, which interesting, like Rockhill and company kind of don't, and say that really this was also like the origins of neoconservatism, aka the Frankfurt School, aka Jews, and that it was really just Jewification, for lack of a better word, of Marxism, that some of them even went so far, such as Kerry Bolton on the European New Right, to actually claim that like Stalin was their guy, which was this weird resurrection of some truly bizarre shit like Francis Yakiism. This is all kind of tangential to your book, but I wanted to talk about the element of your book that I didn't really know myself, even though I knew about LaRoucheites, because when I was in the conservative movement, I knew some former George Bush supporting former neocons who got liquidated in, like, I mean, one of my friends literally he's now a leftist, but he was at the time he was a kind of George Bush neoconservative who got liquidated in Bear Stearns and then like started and got radicalized. But the first thing he got radicalized towards was LaRoucheism. So I knew about it. Later on, he drops it and becomes just more of a standard Marxist. And we weren't the only people in the left-wing circuits that I moved in who had connections like that. The late Paul Shelter had flirtations with radical traditionalism as well. And so I bring this up because I think the lines between the cultural Marxist conspiracies on the right, which I think are much more influential, and this conspiracies on the left are this interesting porous feedback loop. Because as you point out in your book, the initial paleoconservative attacks were actually based off of rebrandings of LaRouche and SDS attacks on Marcuse. And then that's what leads to, this expansion. And it starts off with people like Paul, not with Lind and Gottfried, who have relatively sane, if false, claims. To like, Adorno invented the Beatles. Adorno, it basically becomes Judeo-Bolshevism again. But I think it's important to realize that its origins, despite what some liberals may say, was not just picking up Judeo-Bolshevism and attaching it to the Frankfurt School. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, the LaRoucheites, as I mentioned in the book, really start off as like a faction within the New York Students for a Democratic Society chapter, largely around Columbia. they have a kind of they organize around this particular idea of. I mean, they're taking ideas from Lenin's what is to be done. The way to do revolution is to form more tightly centralized organization with other revolutionary intelligentsia to take Marxist consciousness from without to the working class. The issue is as this group develops is essentially LaRouche wants to operate more as the unquestioned like a cult leader of this group. They have kind of sectarian fights with other student left groups at the time, not only rhetorically but also physically. I mean, there's a lot that I don't talk about in the book.
Involved?
Yeah, I mean, even before you get to the nunchucks, I mean, you listen to these accounts of like these SDS meetings in the late 60s and late 70s, and they're pushing people up against the wall and sort of screaming at people in people's faces. And so there's a kind of like bubbling tension that is always threatening to turn into violence. They have a big, I mean, this is even like a complicated episode in itself, but they have a disagreement with the rest of the New York SDS about the teacher strike in the late 60s between unionized teachers in a certain neighborhood and black parents who want to have more community control over their children's education. This is around the time that the Ford Foundation were kind of experimenting with the idea of community control as a way to kind of recoup the sort of more radical initiatives of the time. There are some good pieces on Jacobin about this, but this split within the New York SDS is largely what causes the LaRouche to go on a kind of trajectory outside of the left and more towards the right later on. As we talked about in the 70s, LaRouche becomes ever more paranoid, starts to think that not only is the CIA, KGB, and MI5 brainwashing his followers to assassinate him, but that they are that through the mass media they are trying to brainwash people to prepare them for a global genocide, including members of what was then the post New Left, like the Weather Underground. And where the Frankfurt School enters into this is the idea that Marcuse is part of a larger counterintelligence apparatus to turn people like Mark Rudd of the Weather Underground, Angela Davis of who was then the leader of the Communist Party, and other kind of post New Left radical groups to sort of form a kind of a fascist movement to sort of stage a larger takeover of not only the United States but also the world. And because of this sort of turn towards a kind of more paranoid politics, they they isolate themselves on the left and decide that if they're going to try and get more supporters, more donations, they're going to try and form links with the right. And one of the first successful links that they make is with the Liberty Lobby group, which is led by Willis Carto. I mean, to go back to Francis Parker Yockey, I mean, Willis Carto is the kind of inheritor of Yockey's thought in the United States. And later on, he goes on to form connections with Linz, 2 decades after having this cooperation with the LaRouche movement. So, I mean, you see these these kind of recurrent figures of people who are sort of organizing on the left and organizing on the right, sort of sharing ideas and having that continuity over time. And then when the LaRouche movement get into the 80s, they kind of suit up a bit and try to become much more respectable. I mean, there are other ideas within the LaRouche movement that we can really cover, but around that time, they were interested in sort of recruiting people who were into the sciences, and they had this group called the Fusion Energy Foundation that was interested in the ideas of kind of defense in space that would sort of end up resembling Reagan's Star Wars program,
which they would then take credit for, right?
Which they would then take credit for, which they, despite the fact that they had nothing to do with. But this actually led for them to kind of have closer links with the CIA, the NSC, and also the Reagan administration. They started to kind of change their branding as an organization from saying, we are Leninists, we are revolutionary intellectuals, to actually presenting themselves as not Republicans as in the Republican Party, but kind of Republicans as in the sort of believer of but believers in the Republic as set down by Plato. They said that they were part of a secret elite of thinkers that sort of had a continuous line since the days of Plato, and they were opposed to people. And they were opposed to a counter elite that was apparently inspired by Aristotle. And by the time you get to the 90s, they are sort of participating in sort of more kind of conservative and right-wing polemics around political correctness, which is where you sort of then get the entry point of these narratives about the Frankfurt School into the into the paleoconservative circles and what would become the kind of radical traditionalist movement.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is actually really interesting to me because how porous these lines are is actually really understood. Think about Paul Piccone over there at Telos Magazine, which for a long time saw itself as explicitly the inheritors and regulators of the Frankfurt School of Thought for a whole lot of the quote unquote left, but they also had ties to a lot of, let's just say, maverick people like Christopher Lasch, but then people who convert to the right for other reasons, such as Eugene Genovese, the former Emory professor who went from a Marxist analysis of slaves, although it was kind of weird and a little bit pro-Confederate even back then, to through being a supporter of Eurocommunism and to being a supporter of neo-Confederatism by the 90s and aughts.
And also, I mean, David Horowitz too is another classic example of this.
Well, but for example, Paul Gottfried, though, at one point when Piccone is moving Telios more and more right-wing in the 1990s, the radical traditionalists get their own issue of Telos Magazine. So there's an issue debated. I think Gottfried was one of the editors, and it's like devoted to like Alain de Benoit and thinkers like that. And I find it really understudied how much influence there was, and the LaRouche seemed to be the model for it. But the other thing that does occur to me is, ironically, given that what I just said about neoconservatives, and I think Sean KB pointed this out on this Records interview, that the LaRouche mythology, while way more elaborate than the Leo Straussian mythology, actually sounds a lot like it, about like we're secret inheritors of a secret tradition of Plato. And while I am not accusing Dominica Lacerdo of being a conspiracy theorist, one of the interesting things that I've seen about the Western Marxist stuff is they also have a trans-historical narrative about, like, for Lacerdo, it's Christianity. For this inspires Carlos Garrido over at the Midwestern Marx to claim that, like, it's probably Parmenides, and there's this ideological mistaken Western culture that leads
Mhm.
to ultra leftism, blah 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 blah. And I find it funny that these myths that really are very right wing coded keep on showing up on the
Mhm.
left exactly through this lens. It
Mhm.
is often legitimate critiques of well, how legitimate I can get into, but like we do know that, for example, Adorno is a complicated figure, but
Mhm.
like Horkheimer basically supports the Vietnam War.
Mhm.
Marcuse doesn't, interestingly
Mhm.
enough. And what Rockhill will say about the Marcuse problem with the OSS is, yeah, sure, we admit that
Mhm.
Sweezy and Varn were also working for the OSS.
Mhm.
There's a whole lot of communists working
Mhm.
for the OSS during the Popular Front. Many of them good Marxist Leninists and
Mhm.
members of the CPUSA. That the issue is that Marcuse stayed on with the State Department after the Red Scare
Mhm.
kicked in. And
Mhm.
I find this interesting because we have to parse the fact that there's some legitimate stuff to be worried about there. But
Mhm.
even Rockhill doesn't necessarily convince me that um that this was that like the CIA was telling him exactly how to write The One-Dimensional Man and those books. And
Mhm.
the other thing that I have trouble when we talk about the history of the time period, and you have the LaRouche sites, but you also have the fact that it's just you can't throw a sock on a college campus without hitting someone 2 degrees removed from the State Department, the
Mhm. Yeah,
CIA,
yeah.
our military intelligence in
Mhm.
the 1950s and 60s.
Mhm.
Like when you like these right wing, and it's mostly right wing conspiracy theorists that used to tell me this, and I would go and verify it. And some of the stuff they claim was true was
Mhm.
like William Buckley had CIA ties,
Mhm.
Gloria
Yeah.
Steinem had CIA ties,
Mhm.
Terrence fucking McKenna had CIA ties, Dennis Leary
Mhm.
had CIA ties. You go through them, and they would take these true statements,
Mhm.
combine it with this LaRoucheite stuff, then we can come back to the
Mhm.
nature of this myth, and then concoct this thing where really secret Marxists had taken over everything,
Mhm.
but had done it all through the cultural turn, a
Mhm.
la some strange reading of Gramsci, which I also find interesting that they impute to the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School hardly ever talk about Gramsci.
Mhm.
Um,
There are some weird attempts to try and link the Frankfurt School and Gramsci. I mean, one of my favorites is James Lindsay. And I think that
mhm.
he tried to prove that. I mean, Lukács and Gramsci met each other. That's indisputable. But he also tried to prove that sort of Horkheimer was hanging around at the same time, and because of that, because of somehow meeting Gramsci, that inspired him to write traditional and critical theory. Um, I mean, it obviously can't be proved, but I mean, there are these attempts to try and fold Gramsci into the Frankfurt School, despite the fact that Gramsci was much more involved in sort of in party matters than many members of the Frankfurt School. But I mean, also to go on what you're saying about the CIA being everywhere. I mean, the LaRoucheites, in their critiques of the Weather Underground being a proto-fascist organization, which I mean it's sort of based on an idea that it's a kind of petty bourgeois adventurism that can maybe later on sort of become the street fighting faction of a fascist party. But that they're making these accusations about the CIA, and there are plenty of CIA people in the Weather Underground. It's just that they were there to spy on the members in the Weather Underground, as it was the sort of uncovered by the Church Committee.
Right. I mean, well, I think about like the number of CIA members in the Avakian RCP.
Hmm.
Because I've read, I helped publish a whole book on that. Um, which has been declassified, after the
Hmm.
Church Commission got so much of the COINTELPRO files
Hmm.
declassified. And I'm like, okay,
Hmm.
so when we look at these CIA handlers, it becomes a problem. Another issue that they would talk about is all the funding lines, but
Hmm.
it's just that's another thing Rockhilda talks
Hmm.
about, and they're real. But what we don't know, and we really don't know this, it's like with the Congress of Cultural Freedom, Christopher Lasch outed it as a CIA front through speculation about its relationship to James Burnham as early as the late 1960s. But in the 50s, we don't know who knew what, because there's so many Marxists who get sucked up in those Congress for Cultural Freedom things. It's not just a partisan review. And one of the things that your book had me thinking about is like, and it's hard to parse now because under Trump, somehow neoconservatism and paleoconservatism, two dire enemies, have now merged into one hybrid weird beast. But for people who don't know the history, like on the right, although LaRouche lights were weird during the Iraq War, because that's like what side they were on was actually kind of strange. But on the right, a lot of these cultural Marxist conspiracy people were actually anti-war, anti-Iraq war, because they saw it as basically a bunch of crypto trots who were inspired by the Frankfurt School and then got sucked up by Leo Strauss, starting a war only in the benefit of Israel. But today, that's, you can't really make that argument because the distinctions between the paleoconservatives and the neoconservatives are, I mean, the neoconservatives are kind of split into two factions. The ones willing to join with the Trumpists and the ones who are willing to more or less become Democrats. I find this interesting because the way in which these cultural Marxist conspiracies just branched out into so many other ones. I mean, it's interesting to me because I do think, like I said, a lot of Rock Hill's fans are guilty of what I'm about to say, even though I don't think Gabriel actually necessarily is. Gabriel blames the CIA for quote funding and influencing Western Marxism as an intellectual project in academia, but he doesn't actually say the CIA brought it about. Like, he doesn't think the CIA brought about the Frankfurt School. You know, he thinks that they were collaborators in some way. But if you go on Facebook or X and look at any comments on that, on when anyone criticizes Rock Hill, you will immediately see people just start claiming Western Marxism is a CIA conspiracy, which isn't even what Rock Hill's arguing. And I find it really does look like a return of that LaRoucheite stuff. And the fact that so many people in that orbit, like I mentioned, Midwestern Marx, have become MAGA communist or weird, like right-left hybrids, which is something that paleoconservatives and radical traditionalists have always aimed for. Like, I pointed out that I was reading your book this morning, and I was thinking about William Lind and how there's still this, like, when if you look at Duginism and its attempt to like influence a lot of anti-imperialism, and Dugin is explicit. I pointed out in Fourth Political Theory where he says verbatim that they intend to use Marxism as a fifth column. Like, he just says it straight up. He says it in print. It's not hidden. But if you look at like how this all ties into this, there's these weird lipstick traces that you start finding. So one of the things that people don't really talk that much about, because Dugin seems so anti-neoconservative because he hates Atlanticism, that that people don't realize that his multipolarity is fundamentally based off of Samuel Huntington's class of civilization thesis. In fact, it's one of the things he says explicitly. And I saw your eyes puck up because then that ties him directly to William S. Lind, which is where that theory really comes from. Before before Huntington stole it and wrote a book about it at a conference that's held secretly. Not secretly, but it's a very elite conference held by scholars at the Stanford Institute. I actually I knew a scholar who went to it. And he basically just stole William Lynd's theory and made it academically respectable at that conference.
But because before that, I mean, William Lind was basically arguing the Clash of Civilizations thesis, but he was doing it in kind of like military theory journals, which like only people who were like at military colleges were reading, whereas Huntington took it straight to like foreign policy magazine, I should say, and it became a hit.
Right, it's still one of the most read books in all of academia, wildly, because it's really sloppy. But I remember like looking at its list of civilizations and just like Japan as a civilization. I'm like, okay,
I mean, I mean, we could probably get to this, but this is exactly what happens in Lynd's novel Victoria, which is basically like a fictionalized rendition of like what will happen in the Clash of Civilizations if it happens exactly how I think about it. And there's a scene where like the character, well, actually, there's a character in it that is supposed to be William Lynd, but the protagonist goes to Japan and has a conversation with people over there, and the Japanese characters are like, we won't have individuality, we only have the collective, and then the protagonist writes some haiku at the end to prove how like the Western individual is superior to sort of like quote unquote Asiatic collectivism.
Yeah, that old canard. It is it's interesting how these ideas don't go away and how influential they are. I mean, with LaRoucheism is wild because there's this weird obsession with the British that sometimes seems like it's a proxy for the Jews, and I mean almost explicitly. And then sometimes,
I mean, I'm surprised you didn't like it because of your anti-English bias,
right? Exactly. But sometimes it feels like, you know, just a rant I had on Tuesday, where I'm like blaming the Queen for everything. No, I mean it is interesting, like what it does, and it was also interesting with LaRoucheism. They maintain one of the fascinating weirdnesses about LaRoucheism is they critique the cultural Marxists and claim to basically be Marxist. But also, if you really get into their theory on the inside, they also claim that Marx is actually a product of the evil British / maybe the Jews too, and that this is still part of the Aristotelian war against Plato. And what is strange about that is, I think, you know, that's obviously hyper crazy in your conspiracy theory levels, but it is funny in that there is a real sense in which like Aristotelianism is really influential in Marxism, and you do have to actually kind of admit that, because Marxist categories really come from Aristotle via the discussions around and Adam Smith. And
well, I mean, really, when it comes to like the LaRoucheites, it is, I mean, underneath all of the like the weird, like this has been like 1,000 years of conspiracy, it is just like that, like idealism versus empiricism. As just sort of like a debate between two philosophical viewpoints. What's weird about LaRoucheism is that they sort of have all of this weird baggage about, you know, how like, you know, Henry Kissinger is secretly gay, and that's part of the conspiracy. And, you know, William F. Buckley fucks his dog. And so they kind of get distracted in all of these kinds of like weird sort of conspiratorial aspersions instead of, I don't know, being what they essentially are, which is sort of like actually quite talented grad students. I mean, basically most of the original founders of the LaRouche movement are kind of like classicists or like sort of philosophers, and they accidentally became part of like this political organization that sort of I don't know, rubbed their egos in a certain way, and were essentially like you are the smartest people, not only in the room but also in the kind of in the universe almost.
Well, this lets me to ask you, like, maybe we should focus down on the LaRouche ties before I get into, because we're going back and forth.
Yeah.
No, that's me. That's not you. I wanted to think about, like, one of the things that you look at with LaRouche is the way this organization becomes more and more conspiratorial. Originally, they're just extremely rigorous, kind of weird Trotskyists who are willing to engage in conspiratorial slander of people they disagree with for ideological reasons. But and you see that across the sectarian left, particularly in this time period. I mean, the SDS was always trying to stamp down on it internally, but also not kick anyone out. And the only people they ever kicked out
was the
LaRoucheites, like, because they basically had we'll get over the sectarianism of the old. I mean, kind of sounds like stuff today in the DSA, to be quite frank. I always say the DSA has a lot of SDS roots, and Harrington comes out of that. And I know DSA is like, we're not Harringtonites anymore. I'm like, I know, I get it, but that's not my point. I suppose, like, when you look at this, though, with the LaRoucheites, it's how much more elaborate they get, and they have this issue that when I read the early LaRouche text, they didn't seem that crazy to me if you used to sectarian Trotskyist and Maoist text. Like, and then you keep going, and they get weirder. And you start having this insistence on the importance of European classical music. And you have this, like, weird stuff about Kant and Plato and, like, hyper idealism coming up. And then you have, like, the like, we're Marxist. Aha, no, we're not anymore. Like, secret stuff in the. Why do they go so much further into their weirdness and need these conspiracy theories? And because I think we see this again. I think we're seeing another time period that's going to generate a lot of this.
Oh yeah. I mean, part of it is, I mean, just to maybe even just sort of be a classic Gramscian here, it often tends to be of how kind of organizations are built and how they operate. I think with certainly coming out of the period of the late 60s, where there are a bunch of different groups in the SDS who believes that the right way to go was essentially just to do Leninism again, instead of but a particular type of Leninism that wasn't kind of very responsive to the political situation of the time. I think that the way that they were building organizations meant that it was quite easy for someone like LaRouche to construct an organization that was just sort of built around the protection and the promotion of his own thoughts. And because of that kind of personalization of power within an organization, you get a where you then get tempted or maybe drawn towards forms of historical explanation that are sort of more personalist, I guess, and that kind of leans in towards more conspiratorial thinking. But also, I mean, then on top of that, in the 1970s, you see a big rise of, like, conspiracy culture. I mean, there are sections of, one of the best works on the early life of the LaRouche movement by Kevin Coogan, who wrote under the pseudonym Hylozoic Hedgehog, that when LaRouche believes that there were people out to assassinate him, that his own followers had been brainwashed to betray him. He'd been watching films like The Parallax View, or like episodes of, like, cop procedurals that featured like heavy conspiratorial elements, and so there is this like this this general turn towards the more conspiratorial over the course of the 70s that is felt quite palpably, not only just in the culture but also in just like what's happening in the news. I mean, we mentioned it before, like, but there's the Church Commission that happens in the 70s. There's Watergate that happens in the 70s, and so like there is a sense in which like conspiratorial explanations become more plausible. And I mean, one of the ways that we're seeing it now is, you know, the whole Epstein stuff. I mean, we're getting to the point where, like, even in sort of White House sort of investigation, or maybe the congressional investigation of people comparing, you know, what happened with Epstein to Pizzagate. So even with these sort of stories of conspiracy, in the sense that power is now sort of wrapped up with particular people, there is a sort of more leaning towards kind of conspiratorial explanations. I think that's where the repetition is, and it has to do potentially with this sort of like the crisis of like the crisis of particular dominant ideologies, and the sense that particular, you know, the classes who are supposed to sort of run everything are losing people's confidence, not only materially but sort of also ideologically as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, this gets me to like an element of Gramsci that I think is underexplored, which is his attempt to deal with subjective and conjective conditions amongst the ruling classes, because one of the things that Gramsci is concerned about, and this is from Lenin, this is straight up from Lenin, he's trying to flesh it out, is that the subjective and objective conditions on the revolutionary side is not just about the ideologies around the revolutionary classes. You know, for Lenin, that's primarily the working class, the secondary, maybe the peasantry, depending on the time period Lenin's talking. What is clear here is, though, is like they are picking up this concern from Gramsci about the decayed leadership class. And one of the things that classical Leninists would have offered during this time period is the 70s had an objective economic crisis and a subjective ideological crisis, but they never melded into a movement of any kind. And in fact, the classical Leninist thing, which unfortunately I also see being abandoned a lot by Marxists today, I literally wrote a letter to Compact Magazine about this, is that conspiracism muddled this process in some key ways. It was actually an offset from it, because even though conspiracies are real, and like, you know, Lenin wrote about the you know, the secret police all the time, that it becomes over explanatory for what is going on, and actually can be used as a way of saving elements of capitalism, which is what both the Judea Bolsheviks and William Lynn slash who else used to do this stuff of these old guard. Guy wrote Leviathan and His Enemies, Sam Francis. And these like people who were quasi-right nationalists. I mean, like, Lind is interesting because he's smart, and for those people who don't know, and he's also
and funny.
Yeah, no, he's hilarious, actually. Lind is fascinating because he does seem to have picked up on this stuff from LaRouche. Although, do you know how directly he was influenced?
Okay, so like this is basically, I mean, I have a friend, Ian Gardner, shout out, proper lad, and he managed to talk to a lot of the people who were in my book. I mean, but by the time that I started seriously researching this, I mean, I got a lot of like requests to have interviews rebuffed because they could just Google my name and see that exactly who I was and what my motivation was. But he was able to get interviews with these people like Michael Minnesino, who is in the LaRouche movement. He got like an interview with William S. Lind and a whole bunch of sort of LaRoucheites and people who are around it in that area. And what you found out was that a guy called Raymond V. Rhine, who was friends with William S. Lind, got like sent a copy of one of these LaRouche magazines, which the LaRouche movement were doing all the time. And basically, they're classic Trotskyists of like setting up different front groups and then printing out a whole bunch of newspapers and magazines and sending them out to everyone. And Raymond V. Rhine was sort of kind of compelled by this idea, and he ends up writing what is called it's a document called Critical Theory: a Special Research Report, and that was written in 1996, and it's completely lost. Like my friend Ian has like spoken to Raymond Rhine's daughter. And apparently, just all of his papers, all of his books, just sort of either got thrown out or sold elsewhere. But it is kind of quoted in various other documents. But apparently, I think on an episode of The Next Revolution, which was the TV show that William S. Lind hosted, that was run by the New Right think tank Free Congress Foundation, and was basically the precursor to Fox News. I mean, everyone who worked on national empowerment television ended up working for Fox News. He mentioned how he basically got all of these ideas about the Frankfurt School from Raymond Rhine, who got them from the LaRoucheites. But for Lind, I mean, he's clever. He was clever enough to like basically strip the basic narrative, basic elements of all of like the weird LaRoucheite points, and just sort of to keep the kind of more plausible narrative about the Frankfurt School, which then informed his like version of cultural Marxism. So, I mean, as I write in the book, I mean, what's kind of almost underwhelming about it is that it's just all coincidence. It's just sort of like a mate of William S. Lind happened to get a magazine one day, and he sort of found one of the articles semi-convincing, and he wrote something about it, which then Lind was like, well, this seems very similar to what I am writing about at the moment. Because then before then, he sort of was using terms like, originally his term was cultural radicalism. That was the term he used for all of the different trends that he would eventually associate with cultural Marxism. Then early in the 90s, he starts using the phrase social and cultural Marxism, but without any sort of reference to the Frankfurt School. And then when he's starting to write about the Frankfurt School, he just sort of cuts it straight to cultural Marxism, which is a much sort of catchier name. And as he's sort of admitted in interviews, a kind of much more effective, like delegitimizing tool for like sort of turning people off political correctness or turning people off Black Lives Matter. But even then, I'm like, even when I hear that, I think that that's just sort of placing too much, I don't know, maybe too much emphasis on the power of words. Because I mean, I think that the people who who receive messages about cultural Marxism are probably like not that keen on political correctness to begin with. Whereas for William Lind, he's sort of like, well, what will turn people off political correctness is if they think it is cultural Marxism. Whereas I think that people are drawn to the idea of cultural Marxism because, in a certain way, they don't necessarily like things like things that are associated with political correctness or with wokeness. Because I mean, it is still. I mean, even though there are several members in the White House administration now who have used these stories about the Frankfurt School, it's still kind of rare to kind of encounter talk about cultural Marxism more broadly in the comparison to like wokeness. And really, I think the people who pay most attention to like uses of cultural Marxism in political discourse are left-wing people, because we have had a lot of discussions among ourselves about, how the narrative of cultural Marxism is wrong, and and its associations with various sort of much more reactionary figures, or much more sort of extreme figures like Anders Breivik. And it reminds me, I'll wrap up in just a second. It reminds me of a poll that I saw just before the 2020 election. I mean, it's an opinion poll, so the questionable accuracy, but it said that 94% of Democrats knew what QAnon was, and 8% of Republicans knew what QAnon was. And my sort of, on the notepad reasoning of this is because, the left is more eager to sort of pounce on conspiracy theories that the right are speaking about, and sort of report back to our own, rather than actually maybe spends that time focusing on the kind of reactionary or ineffective issues with our own ideas, or our own ideas of organizing our own talking points, right?
Well, yeah, this reminds me, for example, when people learned about Alexander Dugin, you had certain leftists and a lot of liberals all of a sudden discovering what was a real attempt to do some left-wing capture. I do want to say that, like, the Duginists explicitly tried to create a red-brown pipeline. Like, that's not a secret. But this became something that, like, leftists threw at each other. I remember everybody, including even like Donald Parkinson, who wrote a whole treatise on the problems of LaRoucheism, got accused of being red-brown during this time period.
Well, marginal,
yeah. And then weirdly, you started seeing for a brief period that has come back down, but through people like Caleb Maupin, this attempt to actually do a left-right hybrid formation, which kind of all liquidated into the Center for Political Innovation, and then later on into whatever the fuck MAGA communism is, and the ACP, which I guess is an actual organization. And the funny thing is, if you like look at LaRoucheism, the ACP runs in a lot of the same conspiracies, and then will look like they're like doing standard Marxist-Leninist defensism. But then, like, once you get into their actual beliefs and whatnot, all of a sudden you discover that their key documents reference Carl Schmitt and those types way more than anything Marxian. And I think that's an interesting problem that we have to deal with. One of the things, though, that I find so fascinating about this, when we talk about this like left right shuffle on these conspiracy theories, is like how crazy it gets after the Tea Party. Because the two things that really happen is the Tea Party really likes Cold War rhetoric, but applied in very strange ways, like using Mark Rudd and people around the weather undergrounds, like, happened to teach a class that Obama took as this proof of cultural Marxism really being the core of Obamaism, and this, that, and the other. And this is concurrent to what you write a lot about in your book, Breitbart trying to do what the American Conservative and Talking Mag could not do. Probably because they were too opposed to the GOP of the aughts, but which was to mainstream that into the GOP, because American Conservative alienated too many conservatives by being like rabidly anti-Iraq war. Talking Mag had too many ties to explicit right nationalists for National Review types. Andrew Breitbart managed to take a lot of those talking points and strip them of their like Occidental Review and whatnot passed and mainline them for normal conservatives in a way that other people have tried. Like John Derbyshire tried at the National Review, but he got booted for being racist because of it. And Breitbart, which was happening at the same time, somehow managed to avoid all those racial nationalist accusations for a while. And was never, I mean, it really is the ideological glue that takes what the Tea Party's rebellion against, which initially people forget was actually against the Bush administration, then it bled over into it bled over into anti-Obama stuff, and then according to its founders got astroturfed, but took this astroturf new movement that kind of smelt like a moral majority movement, and then got all these radical traditionalist and paleoconservative talking points into it. And now it's like you see these things come out, and you'll see like James Lindsay or Michael Levin or something open their mouth, and even Paul Gottfried and some of the people who codified this reading of history will go. I mean, although Gottfried, like you said, thought this was really just liberalism, would go in and say this is ridiculous. Like you have taken this like way too far. This is dumb. You're embarrassing us. And so it's like, what do you make of that like tendency? Because it does seem to have not just grown, but when we talk about Lind, or even maybe less the LaRoucheites, but Lind's conspiracies sound perfectly fucking plausible. Like they do. I was convinced of them in my 20s, to be quite honest with you. That there have been these liberalizing Marxists who had given up on Marxism because the working class revolution didn't happen, and they gave us Frankfurt School, post-Marxism, post-structuralism, and look at the left in the aughts. It's embarrassing and cringe. And so, I mean, we didn't use those words, but that's what we say now.
Wait until you see the left in the 2020s.
Right, exactly. It's embarrassing and cringe, and I mean, for me, one of the ironies of this is their respect for classical Marxism, ironically imposing it to cultural Marxism, actually started getting me to study Marxism and realizing how bullshit the conspiracy was, including reading Adorno and Gramsci and going, oh, you guys are just stealing their ideas. like you are talking about like cultural Marxist conspiracies, but your theory for change is culture, industry, and cultural hegemony. And that's still true. You see this in Mark Ruffo. You see this, although Mark Ruffo's funny because you can tell him and Matt.
Oh, you mean Chris Ruffo?
Chris Ruffo, not Mark Ruffo. Chris Ruffo, you see this in Christopher Ruffo. You see this in. I remember listening to the Conservatives plus Nina Power, who probably we should just call it conservative, over at Compact, talking to I forget which Jeffrey it was, and they were just parroting like the most vulgar forms of Gramsci, ironically, which was the same form of Gramsci I was taught by liberals who were misconstruing him in the 1990s and aughts, who were totally removing him from his original context. And we need to give the late Assad Hader a lot of credit for actually demystifying Gramsci in English, because Gramsci is one of these people who is cited all the time, and yet no one's ever fucking actually read but like 3 things by him. And they don't even realize that the prison notebooks are in code. And I still don't think they're completely translated. Like, I think we only have some of them. Like,
I mean, but before Joseph Boudiach died, he got to, I think, notebook 8, and those are all the draft notebooks. Those are all the notebooks where Gramsci is still just taking notes. That's before he even sort of tries to work those notes into a more kind of like coherent plan for an essay. So when we get that classic like selections from from the prison notebooks that comes out in the early 70s, that is I don't know, it's a real bastardization of the prison notebooks, but it makes it seem more like the very way it's printed, right? Just makes it seem more complete and more finished than it actually is. I mean, it's kind of like, I mean, just imagine people, you know, a couple of decades after your death, just sort of going through, you know, the things that you jotted down on a legal pad or something. That is, I mean, yeah, I mean, he clearly had like, I mean, when you read his letters, of course, like he had like a very clear research plan. Well, no, he had a number of very clear research plans that became more refined over the years. But yeah, nothing in the prison notebooks is sort of like him going, "Oh, this is my definitive statement," or "This is my final statement," or "This is kind of like a work of political theory that I want to put out there." Because he was, I mean, before then, I mean, he was kind of more like agitational writer. Um, there was one of the letters from Gramsci in prison where he's asked whether he wants to have the articles that he had he'd written in sort of various newspapers into volumes, and his response was like, "No, those are. It makes no sense to collect them into like an essay collection because they're not sort of." Theoretical statements. They are sort of interventions as an organizer, or almost. I think when we are reading prison notebooks, you've got to catch on to. I mean, you've got to try and strike away through what Guido Liguori, who's one of the best Italian Gramsci scholars, through the pathways of this thought. I mean, it is never kind of the kind of concepts that we've sort of frozen from the texts. Sort of, I mean, to borrow, I mean, what I think is maybe one of the better ideas from Gabriel Rockall's work. They are kind of commodities in the theory industry of like these are terms that we can use that sort of signal a kind of radical chic, but when you use those concepts from Gramsci, people often forget that for him those were concepts in movement. They were the concepts themselves weren't ideas. They were sort of a way into his method or a way into his thinking. Sorry, I feel like that's like a tangent on Gramsci, but I mean, like I should mention that this book sort of grew out of my dissertation, where the first two chapters were me doing like we're essentially kind of doing a reading of Gramsci and what it means to sort of study what it would mean to sort of use his approach to intellectual practices as a way to sort of talk about the intellectual history of ideas that are used in political praxis. Like I see cultural Marxism being used. And sort of striking that line between the sort of philological research that's coming out of Italy at the moment about like what Gramsci was sort of thinking through at the time when he was writing the prison notebooks with what is sort of necessary now, and like trying to think in a Gramscian way about what is happening and the histories that sort of have fed into the conflicts that we have now. And I don't necessarily know the answer, but like this is like the whole kind of premise of my book that's completely cut out, because at the same time, I don't know necessarily if everyone who's reading this book wants to have like 100 pages of sort of exegesis of the prison notebooks before they start reading about LaRouche.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important though, because understanding what Gramsci was actually on about makes a lot of these claims particularly ludicrous. And then the other thing is just a historical I mean, Gramsci is a figure filled with historical ambiguity because the ultra left of Italy wants to distance themselves from them, even though Bordiga didn't actually have nearly as hostile a relationship to Gramsci as is assumed from his like Lyon's thesis stuff. He literally like hung out with them on the prison island, apparently. And like apparently it is recorded that he even talked about trying to break Gramsci off the island, and then he gets sent out into the public, and Gramsci doesn't, and Gramsci dies before anything happens. But also like Togliatti, whose name I am undoubtedly mispronouncing, also has this myth around Gramsci, says Gramsci is not the founder of the Italian Communist Party, but he is the first general secretary of the Italian Communist Party, and they use that fact to write Bordiga out of the history. And so he's already a figure that is contested in the history of Marxism. He's also, somebody that everybody claims because, like Rosa Luxemburg, he dies before a lot of splits are completely hardened. But like, while Gramsci goes through with the Bolshevization of the Italian Communist Party, which is really a different Italian Communist Party. The other thing is the Italian Communist Party goes into clandestine mode, and even in like most official histories, the first Italian Communist Party and the second Italian Communist Party, even though Togliatti is the through line and a claim to the lineage of Gramsci is the through line, they aren't the same party, like because the elements that came together in the late 30s during the Popular Front really weren't the same elements that brought together the first Italian Communist Party, and this even shows up in a lot of like abbreviations that they abbreviate them differently. I bring all this up though because that makes Gramsci like an ideal figure for first liberals because they can recast them in terms of, and my lineage there is this comes out of like the late 60s recasting of Gramsci in terms of the formal Comintern aligned parties turning to Eurocommunism, and so Gramsci becomes a way to justify that switch, and it becomes a kind of bridge to post-Marxism. But it is a
and then also the topic of Chantal Mouffe's first book,
right? Exactly. Which my pet Nora Chantal Mouffe literally just wrote a pamphlet with Daniel Tutt that is basically Moufism bad. Like, but I find this is why I've been so grateful for Assad Haider, because he goes back and goes into what we do know about Gramsci in a lot more nuanced ways, and we realize that like, so you have a Euro-communist reconception of Gramsci, which affects a liberal reconception of Gramsci, which is also picked on by both the LaRouche and William Lynn as this mechanism explaining, somehow how the Frankfurt School is variant. Now, I do think the Frankfurt School is variant from both Bolshevism and quote unquote classical Marxism, but ironically, if you actually read Gramsci and stuff about cultural hegemony, that's already in Lenin. He's just trying to work it out more. Like that's in Lenin. Lenin writes about hegemony. Like,
no, even Gramsci's theory for the intellectuals, which I mean, a lot of people sort of say, "Oh no, it's all about the distinction between traditional organic intellectuals." They also never mention that distinction is totally provisional in Gramsci's work, and it's not like those are like two separate concepts. It's all about like a spectrum of organicity. The Italian word is organicità or something along those lines. But yeah, I mean, he's basically trying to sort of resolve what he saw as maybe a kind of limitation of Lenin's ideas of the intelligentsia, of like how are you sort of then fighting for proletarian self-emancipation if your whole vision of revolution revolves around the ideas a party of intellectuals coming to essentially swoop in and save the working class, and I mean, his approach to intellectuals is to sort of continuing what Lenin wrote, but sort of improving upon it. I mean, Gramsci is a total Leninist, and I think that the sort of narrative that Lind and others spin about sort of Gramsci and Lukács totally breaking with, I guess, the breaking with the tradition of Marxism after the Bolshevik Revolution is sort of misplaced.
Mhm.
Because I mean, even in the sort of famous piece that Gramsci writes of sort of against capital, where he's observing that Russia is the place where people didn't, according to sort of second international theories, that's not where the revolution should take place. What was my point here? That's not where the revolution should take place. He's specifically aligning himself with Lenin, with Bolshevism, and that's what Lind says that him and the Frankfurt School are totally trying to break away from. Which is why he says that he doesn't use the phrase cultural Bolshevism. There's a 1990s interview where he's with the American Free Press, which is sort of associated with Liberty Lobby, who are sort of more kind of, a more neo-Nazi group, and he gets asked why he uses the term cultural Marxism rather than cultural Bolshevism, and you can tell that Lind doesn't actually, or maybe is pretending not to know the way that cultural Bolshevism was used, or the meaning of cultural Bolshevism, because he says that Bolshevism is all about having like this sort of frontal assault on the state, whereas like cultural Marxism is this sort of more gradualist thesis about sort of taking over a society. So to wrap this thought up, this is kind of why I in the book I say that it's maybe too simplistic to say that cultural Marxism is just a sort of a taking of cultural Bolshevism and rebranding it as another term, because for the person William S. Lind who came up with this term and associated it with the Frankfurt School, he didn't really demonstrate an awareness of it. But when he encounters, the people on further to the right who are familiar with this history, they're able to take it on and put it into their forums. Put it into places like Metapedia, where they're able to present the two ideas as synonyms.
Yeah, I mean, this stuff about Metapedia and this stuff in the early aughts, where there is a deliberate recombining of Judeo-Bolshevism and cultural Marxism, which I will to give some of these William Lind and Paul Gottfried and some of these other paleo-conservatives credit, with the exception of people like Joe Sobran, who actually always linked the two. They did actually try to move away from that. What is fascinating to me, though, is what they have actually ended up doing is combining all these theories in a rude morass of where Judeo-Bolshevism is back on the table, even when people like Richard Spencer were critical of it. Like, if you think about, I remember reading Richard Spencer or Greg Johnson of Countercurrents, which is there's two countercurrents. One is extremely right-wing and one is not. But one is Trotskyist. They're not the same thing. But of Countercurrents, and they had this like very strange splitting the baby on anti-Semitism of like we have to, like, we can't really blame everything on Western all the problems of Western culture on the Jews, and then if we do that, we also have to exclude so much of Western culture, blah blah blah. And they basically get laughed out of the room later on. But that was actually early on kind of the default alt-right stance, was like,
and sorry if I can just interrupt, but I just wanted to mention that in like I talk about this in the book, but the 2002 Holocaust denial conference that Linz goes to. That's picked up by the Southern Poverty Law Center, where he's offering this theory of cultural Marxism. And as part of his typical spiel about sort of why the Frankfurt School had to leave Germany in the Nazi period, he does say that some members of the Frankfurt School were Jewish. What happens immediately after that, when you read the report on the conference, is that this guy called, do you know E. Michael Jones?
Yeah, I know of you.
He stands up immediately afterwards. He sort of starts berating Lind for not being tough enough on Jewish people, and how Jews, came to the United States and tried to sort of persecute Catholics, which is his whole thing. And so there is that kind of like. There is that angle of people like William S. Lind or William S. Spencer trying to get away from these sort of more anti-Semitic things, and that has been sort of continuous throughout the history of this.
Yeah, I remember this when Jordan Peterson is, because you and I met to talk about this in Boise. And we were talking about Peterson's use of neo-Marxism, and I was like, well, it's basically a weird mixture of Judeo-Bolshevism and cultural Marxist conspiracies, but cleaned up of all the anti-Semitic implications of either one, right? The anti-Semitic implications of either theory. But when you even were in paleo-conservative Ron Paul world, they were not nearly as quiet about that. They were very clearly beginning to relink the two ideas, even though they were separate. And I remember, this is one of the things that horrified me, is hitting a Joe Sobran article and a Solzhenitsyn article being shared by somebody on Rocco Rock Tom, basically just raving about how the Jews calls Bolshevism, and then they calls cultural Marxism, and that they owe us an apology, blah 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 blah. If they weren't, even though it wasn't quite as anti-Semitic as you might later get.
Well, I do think about one of the last Charlie Kirk broadcasts, where he's talking about the Palestinian protests and saying, Jewish people are the number one donors of this sort of quasi Marxist ideas, and so they are now sort of reaping what they've sown when it comes to pro-Palestinian protests, right? With the implication being that Palestinian solidarity is anti-Semitic. But I mean, then on top of that, there is the whole kind of, I mean, to link it back to stuff that we've talked about earlier, is what the motivations are for people like the LaRoucheites, people like the paleoconservatives, to be anti-war in certain contexts as well.
Which means you can tie this also. You can somehow, I mean, the real leap is to do the Frankfurt School Congress of Cultural Freedom Partisan Review, Leo Strauss, the Commentary Magazine, to the Reagan administration. Oh, those are the guys who beat us out in Reagan fusionism, because Pat Buchanan was originally part of that. But by the 80s, when both Buchanan and Robinson lose the nomination for the GOP president against, I believe, George Herbert Walker Bush, or is it in 92? I don't know.
It's 92, because
it's 92, not 88.
He delivers a great speech at the RNC. To concede to Bush, where he talks about that Clinton, the most thing he knows about foreign policy is having breakfast at the International House of Pancakes. That's where that line comes from. Yeah.
Well, what's funny about that is I'm glad I'm talking to a scholar, because I'm pulling from this from my memory as a child, because I remember following this stuff, and by the aughts, you have these Ron Paul is seen as the like way to clean a lot of this up. That doesn't work out so well, and their ties to I mean, remind people about the ties to Trumpism here. Pat Buchanan ran against Trump
for the Reform Party
for 2000 for the Reform Party, and
Yeah.
Trump was supposedly the more moderate of the two at the time. And quote unquote the less racist one. I had a never Trump friend of mine who used to like harass me about it, and then I realized he supported Trump in the Reform Party debates in 2000. And I realized like, oh, he was fighting with himself, not me. There is direct links to all this. The other thing is Breitbart. I think we need to talk about the function of Breitbart to normalize.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
Because we talked about it a little bit, but like Breitbart takes these conspiracies that also rhyme with Tea Party talking points in the late aughts against Obama, and he does this thing that ties them all together, but strips them of any association with explicit right nationalism somehow, and also makes them dumber in a way that makes them also more likely to be more popular.
Well, he's. I mean, like I talk about in the book, that how I mean to talk about sort of real bastardized interpretation of Gramsci. Like Breitbart is like a son of Rush Limbaugh, and Limbaugh is sort of saying, what we really need to do as conservatives, as people on the right in America, is to sort of follow what Gramsci advised us to do, and sort of really like get engaged in sort of cultural struggle. And I think that Andrew Breitbart is just sort of one of those. I mean, I didn't always want to like. I didn't necessarily want to subscribe to like a great man of history thesis, but I think that at certain points in history, there are people who are kind of quite talented and quite who are quite talented who managed to perform a function within certain political movements, or are able to sort of fit into what is happening at the time to achieve something. And I think with Andrew Breitbart himself, I think that he was like one of the first conservative social media influencers. So he was able to sort of start. He was riding the beginning of the wave to the sort of media landscape that we see today. That's based on a kind of on various kinds of technologies, various kinds of platforms that have been rewarded or cultivated or built on where capital is right now. And I think that Breitbart was just sort of a kind of premonition of Chris Rufo, or in like all of these sort of people on Twitter who are able to get kind of messages out there to be shared, even if they are not kind of right, but they are sort of successful in a way. What is kind of like a counterpoint to this is like where then do you put Nick Fuentes? Because Nick Fuentes is kind of like a crossover of Andrew Breitbart and Richard Spencer, right?
Right, but without the European new right baggage that Richard has, because you don't have to read a bunch of obscure European books about racism to be confluent in whatever the fuck Dugan's talking about to understand Fuentes, which you kind of did. I mean, this was one of the things about the alt-right, both as its own movement and as part of Radex, and even the neo-reactionary movement, which got conflated with it, but actually was separate, but still complained of it and still used the same conspiracies. I mean, one of the things about Yarvin and Land is they're also doing the whole like somehow liberalism is just Marxism thing.
Which interestingly, I mean, the first thing I ever wrote about cultural Marxism, and we talked about this at the Boise conference, is I was doing, much more of a conventional sort of academic PhD student at the time. So I was doing like this sort of compare and contrast between like the paleoconservative idea of the cultural Marxism and the dark enlightenment or neo-reactionary idea of the cathedral. And back in the olden days, back in 2018, there were very distinct ideas, and there were neo-reactionary pieces talking about how cultural Marxism was a stupid idea because it suggests that the only thing that's gone wrong with American society happened in the 1950s or 1960s, whereas for neo-reactionaries, what's wrong with the American founding is that it's sort of more, it's the idea of democracy itself. Whereas really for them, a country should be run more like a corporation. But what's happened in the time was, especially in the time of the second Trump administration, is that all of these distinctions are now kind of irrelevant. And I think that's not just because of like some of the compromises that people on the right have made to try and secure more influence within the Trump administration, but also a kind of byproduct of sort of social media itself, where a lot of these different subcultures or these different narratives end up becoming conflated with one another, and there's no longer the kind of intellectual effort put into trying to distinguish them. I don't know if that's really true, but I mean, it's something that I've just sort of, it's off the dome. It's off the dome.
No, well, I think that's an interesting problem, because when you also look at like people like a Rome McIntyre who are like J.D. Vance, and that they were just standard neoconservative Republicans in the aughts until after COVID. They've been actively going back and trying to retie this into elite theory with James Burnham, cultural Marxist conspiracies, giving it a gloss with a Lester McIntyre who never would have countenanced cultural Marxism conspiracy, even in his conservative term.
But he did write, one of his first books was a critique of Marcuse, of course.
Right. Yes.
Which was a pretty classic critique of sort of Marcuse from the left, really.
Yeah.
Which rhymes in strange ways with sort of like Gabriel Rockville's critique of, Marcuse was too pessimistic about socialist projects or the revolutionary potential of the working class in the United States at the time. Although that's incredibly debatable, and I think that there are people at the time like Varn and Sweesney who also came to the same conclusions.
That is interesting. I mean, what I find fascinating about this though is like, okay, if you take these ideological lineages, then you'll also be surprised to learn what McIntyre thought about Stalin, because he does turn on official MLism after 52. I find this all very fascinating though, because there is a way, what I mentioned earlier, there is a way in which this theory has gotten dumber. I think Jordan Peterson is like, after Breitbart, is the biggest mass popularizer of it. But
I'm sorry to interrupt you. He's not the kind of, because he's getting like a totally, his idea is from a completely different place. But I think that the ideas of postmodern neo-Marxism then creates the conditions for ideas about cultural Marxism to take place, or to grow in popularity. But I will always dispute the degree to which the cultural Jordan Peterson was kind of like consciously or even promoting this idea of cultural Marxism, because really the Frankfurt School is kind of absent from his ideas, and what he's drawing on is really kind of like Randian or sort of more libertarian kind of anti-Marxism that is, at least in its lineage, separate from the kinds of ideas about cultural Marxism that not only I talk about in the book, but that there are. But I mean, I think it comes back to the thing we were talking about earlier, is in like the time of social media, or the time of the conservative influencer, where these distinctions start to no longer matter as much. And so Jordan Peterson is not like a cultural Marxism guy, but the way that he talks about Marxism means that he produces a whole generation of anti-cultural Marxism guys.
Well, I think I would agree with you. I mean, like, one of the things that we both said at that Boise conference is Peterson actually didn't really know what he was talking about, and wasn't picking up on the William, but also wasn't picking up on the William Lind, vaguely LaRouche parts of the conspiracy, and was freaked out when he learned about Judeo-Bolshevism. So he started further hedging his postmodern neo-Marxism categories to also, like Lind and Gottfried and other people, and Richard Spencer, moving away from explicit anti-Semitism, and also for
and getting all of those weird suits.
Yeah, that's true. But I do think you're right. It's in the age of the conservative influencer. When you look at like the Drudge Report, which didn't do this cultural Marxist stuff, it was his own weird thing, and as a now out of the loop because they were Trump skeptics and still kind of are. What you see here is this grand coalescing of all these things, and then it ends up in Alex Jones' world and more standard conspiracy places at the same time as you have it being worked out with people like Arun McIntyre tying it in, because I do think that McIntyre is picking up on Peterson and then tying all these other things into it to try to popularize a kind of synthesis of what is standard old school Republican with like actually explicitly post-fascist movements like radical traditionalism and stuff like that. And your work is interesting in that you're one of the only people who ties all this together, because there's a lot of work right now by Sedgwick et al. On radical traditionalism and like its influence on like fourth positionism and national Bolshevism, but it doesn't go into the more normal paleo conservative overlap. And there really was. I mean, like Pat Buchanan and or occultism, depending on which way you entered, was used as a gateway drug into this stuff. Yeah. And there was a time when like the American conservative, while people like Kevin Phillips were pushing this anti-Bush line over there, and Rod Dreyer was beginning to come up over there, you also had them employ at one point Richard Spencer as their cultural editor, and Paul Gottfried never stopped, both talking to them and also talking to explicit white nationalists, which was weird because Paul Gottfried's Jewish. And but this was really a thing going on. And what I found so strange about this, if you remember the way that, certain kinds of intellectual anti-fascism was going in at the end of the Trump administration, is people weren't paying attention for this obvious stuff, and they were looking at stuff like Order of Nine Angles and like the most dangerous but fringy elements of all this, and like not looking at the stuff that like all you have to do is read the text and you can see the direct lineage. Like William Lind just ends up being like one of these secret, because it's not just classical civilization, it's not just cultural Marxism. He is also one of the primary thinkers on fourth generation warfare, and honestly, he's brilliant on that stuff. He really is. Like when John Dolan came up with Gary
Mhm.
Becker as his voice for War Nerd for his paleo-conservative war critic voice. I'm pretty sure he was basing it off of William Lynn.
Mhm.
You know, partially anyway. I mean, I've never
Mhm.
asked John if he was, but I mean, what do you make of this now? Because the one thing that's brought this all back into prominence is there's a certain kind of Marxist-Leninism. Some people call it neo-Stalinism. I don't, because that's confusing, actually. That has adopted this to some degree. Some of it has stayed in the traditional, normal Marxist-Leninist milieu. And they've gone on to Dominica Lacerda and Gabler Rockhill. But I want to point out, and this is not because I like Lacerda and Rockhill very much, but the claims made in that milieu are more than the actual claims made by Rockhill or Lacerda.
Yes, yeah, totally.
And then from there, you see this all over MAGA communism. And then you start seeing this pop up on the right. And there does seem to be a way in which this my critique of Rockhill isn't that he's necessarily wrong about the Frankfurt School. It's just that, to me, it doesn't explain that much. Like, I'm like, the problems of the SDS were not just because Marcuse gave speeches there. And the problems of sectarian Marxism in the 70s has a lot more to do with the Sino-Soviet split than it does what a few professors were doing, whether or not they had ties to the CIA or not.
And also just organizational problems within those different groups too.
Right. Oh yeah, I mean, like, the SDS is I can't think of an organization which would have been more easy for feds to integrate, and other weirdos. I mean, you know.
Well, I mean, sorry to interrupt, but also the right was struggling with the same problem at the same time. Of like, you have like the big split within Young Americans for Freedom between people who are like, we are libertarians who want to smoke weed and listen to rock music, and then the more sort of traditionalists are sort of like, we just want America to be Catholic. And so at the end of this decade, this is like this weird kind of splitism within like the political movements on both sides of the political spectrum in the country. And I think it just maybe speaks to less like the influence of particular academics, and more about sort of how what the hurdles were to organize a kind of mass organization at the time, with all of the different kind of tendencies going on, which is something that Rockhill just doesn't wrestle with, which is one of my main frustrations with the book, because it is a kind of, I didn't talk about this in my own book, but it's something I'm thinking about more about, sort of like this idea of sort of genealogy without history. It's actually quite easy to establish a genealogy of particular ideas. It's how you sort of blend that with what was going on historically at the same time is where the real struggle comes in.
Yeah, I think this is the issue that I have with Rockhill too, or a lot of people who talk about like how we need to do parapolitics on the left, because I'm like, well, one, we're supposed to be scientific and we have to make conspiracies happen. We talk about them, but we don't just invent speculative narratives without a whole shit ton of evidence. Like when you're talking about the secret police, like trying to infiltrate the Bolsheviks and them promoting Second International Marxist and revisionists like Werner Sombart, who became a Nazi anyway, which the Ukraina, I'm probably mispronouncing that, but the Tsar secret police did. We know they did, but we don't. And Lenin never did, as I actually said in a letter, never said that this was why the Second International failed, and that the ideas in revisionist Marxism were because the secret police were prompting them. And he was just saying they were popularizing them because they would distract from Bolshevik power, which is probably true. And I feel this is also the case. Like if you're saying the CIA was pushing certain Western Marxist ideas because they were Soviet critical, I'd be like, yeah, of course they were. If you say the CIA invented Western Marxism in a lab and explains every failure of the Western left because they weren't, I don't know, pro-China enough. I'm not sure even what they want us to be, since the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. And also, this narrative gives us no answer to the Sino-Soviet split. And in fact, one of the things I point out is I think this is partly a way to get around those problems, that you can just make the Sino-Soviet split disappear. But I do think we have this issue with like this left-white. One of the issues that I've talked to Donald Parkinson about a lot is initially he was super dismissive of Red Brown accusations because of, like, if you remember the book Against Fascist Creep, who was that author?
Alexander Reed Jones. No, Alexander Jones. Alexander Reed Ross.
Right.
I imagine Alex Jones writing for A.K. Press. That would be a wild ride.
But that's kind of what it was. I mean, because Alexander Reed Ross starts off with some true statements about Red Brown associations with this stuff like cultural Marxism, with LaRouche.
It's a super underwhelming book because the further you get in, like
everybody
it becomes more spurious, right?
Right. It's like by the end of the book, I'm like, I think he implicated me. You know, I go around talking about like how weirdly attempts at Red Brownism were actually my way out of the right. One of the many. There's a bunch of reasons I got out of the right, but like it's like that. Freaking out about what radical traditionalism was really code for when I realized it, and also the right, with even the paleo libertarian answer to the economic downturn was absurd in 2007, from 2005 to 2007, and that's what got me out of it, like those three things together. But I have talked a lot about like the ironic thing for Red Brownism for me is like, yeah, it's real, but it actually led me to Marxism. And I'm weird because most fish seem to go in the other part of that stream. I find this very hard to talk about with people because on one hand, you know, when it comes to cultural Marxism, I remember you and I talked about this in Boise, and I said, one of the hard problems with it is like there are things that these right wingers are saying that's true. That the cultural turn does happen in the 60s, that it has an influence on the SDS and thus on the broader left. Although it is wild to me to try to link it to people like Angela Davis, because Angela Davis in the 70s, not in the 90s or aughts, when we think about her being basically a Democrat, is like a really confrontational figurehead after Gus Hall and the CPUSA. And the new communist movement is actually responding largely against the kind of softness of the new left. We tend to see them as like the same thing. But I was like, no, the new left was like Marxian. It's as influenced by like C. Wright Mills and
totally,
and like all these and Staunton Lynn and all these people who were like Marx adjacent, and because they were in the Midwest, didn't get red scared out of and blacklisted weirdly. But they weren't like diehard Marxist in any, like they were mostly like Marx friendly-ish civil rights people. And then,
which is essentially in a way what Marcuse was in America.
No, he was. He's like the Mao friendly version of that, which is also funny because the other thing about the Frankfurt School is if you read the Marcuse Adorno letters, they don't agree on very much with regards to the new left, like at all. I mean, one of the ironies, that even Paul Gottfried talks about this, so I'll give him credit for that, is that the Frankfurt School did not get along well with the actual new left, even if the Frankfurt School was highly inspirational towards it. There's the famous Adorno freaking out and calling the cops on protesters, his defense of the traditional apolitical university. There's Horkheimer's like outright defense of the Vietnam War. Go ahead.
Well, no, but there's also like Adorno's. I mean, Adorno wanted to speak to a bunch of socialist societies and new left groups, and would always be like in dialogue with these people because they were also like his students at the same time. It's just like, I think Marcuse was also strangely an advocate of that, like her apolitical university position. He just felt in the United States that the American university was too complicit in like imperialist wars, too complicit within. I mean, ironically, the security states and with the CIA and things like that. And there was one story that I don't know if you've listened to the Liz Wreckage interview, so you may know this anecdote that I got from Douglas Kellner, who knew Marcuse, who was sort of walking around Columbia University with Marcuse in the late 60s and had the encounter with some Weather Underground people who said, Marcuse, come sit with us and talk through this thing we're trying to figure out. And they were thinking about sort of like vandalizing the office of this professor who was found to have links with the Pentagon. And Marcuse was totally opposed to it. He was like, well, I don't want, you to do these sort of kinds of actions at the university, but if you want to blow up a bank, then I'm totally fine with it. And then a week or two later, there was the news that, people had set fire to a Bank of America over in California. And the degree to which that's influenced by Marcuse is debatable. But I like to think that is sort of, Marcuse's influence in action.
I mean, Marcuse is also weird. It's weird to come after him as super critical of all of actually existing socialism, given his break with a lot of the Frankfurt School over the Vietnam War, which he was very sympathetic to the Viet Cong, and also his explicit flirtations with Maoism, which are, I mean, he even dedicates a book to both Ho Chi Minh and Adorno together.
Oh no, that is by that's edited by Paul Bryant, but that is a book that's sort of written by explicit Marcusians. So what's so ironic about the whole Rock Hill thing is that all of the Marcusians are the people who supported these third world struggles, whereas the people who were like Marcuse as a CIA agent is entirely compromised were the people who rejected those struggles.
Right. I mean,
and so it's
a lot of those are Trotskyists.
Yeah, exactly.
Like explicitly. This is one of the funny things is I'm like, some of these weird conspiracy theories come out of Trotsky land. And
my favorite amusement park.
Yeah, with lots of people's. It's weird. Mao land's also pretty strange though. But they get all muddled in the 70s, kind of on the left, because people start. I mean, one of the things that happens in the 70s after Church Commission is everybody accuses everybody else of being a Fed, often except the actual Feds. Like no one accused Aoki and the Black Panthers of being a Fed, and it came out in the late aughts that he most definitely fucking was. For those of you who don't know that, he was like famous in the Bay Area as being the guy who was gun running for the Panthers, but also apparently he was doing it under the auspices of the CIA or of the FBI. It was the FBI, but still he was an informant. And I find all this stuff kind of amusing today because I'm like, in some ways, I think the issue with the conspiracy theories is in a weird way they're not paranoid enough. To quote Zizek on one of his times where I actually think he made some sense, and that they're too simple, and you're not dealing with the fact that there's like 55 factions trying to fight over influence over these left wingers, and the CIA is of course one of them, and these academics are being funded. I do think it is interesting to note who the CIA was willing to funnel money to and who they weren't, and who was willing to accept it after a certain point and who wasn't. But when we talk about the Congress of Cultural Freedom, like I mentioned, Lash outed what that was in the 60s, but no one before the 60s seems to have known the extent of Central Intelligence Agency involvement in the Congress of Cultural Freedom. Burnham was not, Burnham was not as obvious a figure at that time period, and his relationship to Trotskyism was also a little bit vaguer. And but I also find it ironic that one of the things about this left is Burnhamite categories have been naturalized into like the discourse. So PMC is from John and Barbara Ehrenreich, but it's an attempt to do Burnhamite managerial theory on the left. And this is another way in which these people tie this in together, because one thing you will see in the modern cultural commentariat on the right is complaining about the Frankfurt School as the godfathers of the PMC, which they will use the John and Barbara Ehrenreich because a lot of leftists are familiar with it and have used it in their own critiques.
But they never read part 2 of the essay.
No, they don't.
Everyone always reads part 1. They never read part 2. Which means they come to conclusions that Barbara and John Ehrenreich were like, no, actually, this is a wrong solution to the problem. So everyone ignores the part 2, and everyone just sort of focuses on the part where they're like, this class is a problem for left-wing organizing.
Right. And later on, they miss the part 2, which is, and it's being proletarianized, and there are divisions within it. Some of which are becoming more and more proletarian. Weirdly, there's only 2 people who really pick up on that: Gabriel Winat, and then strangely Christian Parenti. Christian Parenti actually talks bizarrely about the proletarianization of the petite bourgeoisie being why the PMC is actually partially proletarian and has divided interest. But then what he does is he combines that with right-wing administrative state critique to go and say, but they're still protected because the administrative state protects them and as a fateful inroad to the proletariat. Yes, returning us, ironically, from a son of a, well, how much Michael Parenti was actually a Marxist is actually, and I don't mean this as like a gatekeeper of Marxism. I mean, even himself is a little bit up for debate. Because he never joined a Marxist organization. He never he never even said he endorsed Marxism. He was just defending the Soviet Union.
No, I mean, joining a Marxist organization is when you really learn to hate Marxists, which sort of brings us back to sort of cultural Marxism.
Well, this is the other thing. Is like this is really appealing to ex-Marxists who have gone through some organization and be like, this is super fucking annoying. I mean, they're not the only group that does that. There's another group that I may or may not have been involved with at one point that I think does the same thing. But there's, as I always tell people, like, look, I'm in the DSA, but let me tell you that as a 55-year-old man who's been on the left since like 2007, back when that was an old, also back in that part of the period of the left where being 27 actually made you old in the movement. Because
no, you go ahead, sorry.
No, I think that's just fair. What were you about to say?
Oh, no, it was also the period where there were only 2 socialists in the high school. There's one like me who's sort of more like I like Tony Benn, and I'm sort of like a laborite in a certain way, and the other one who's got the hat with the Soviet insignia on the hammer and the sickle on it, and he's constantly yelling about sending people to the gulag. Yeah, but I don't think people around now understand how just sort of like weird or just sort of like it's just sort of rare it was to sort of encounter socialists. Whereas I think in the post sort of Corbyn and Bernie era, I think that there is sort of now this, and it's sort of popular socialism that is still kind of like ineffective in a way.
Oh yeah, I think Well, one of the things is now, I mean, in the case of like the DSA, like you have an organization that has
Sorry, that's just my
people
partner
to the
feeding our cats.
no problem. People to the right of the Progressive Caucus in some ways, doing this, that, and the other, and then in the DSA, and then like Marxist-Leninist caucuses. In addition to like almost every Trotskyist organization, like except for the RCI / formerly MIT, liquidated into the DSA and became something else. They all became different caucuses and this and the other. And that's why I've called the DSA, like when people go, it's a workers' movement, like it's more the clearinghouse of sex. And I say that even in it, like it's just where everybody's at now. And that was like the SDS in the 70s.
Oh yeah, totally.
Which I do think is its equivalent organization, except the SDS was not, as much as I complain about some of the poor organizations organizing in the DSA. It's got nothing on the SDS as being a disorganized clusterfuck. But I mean, I think when you go through those organizations and you deal with like how annoying particularly college students are, and one of the critiques that I think cultural Marxism masks is that the left, particularly the new left, dependence on students because for ideological reasons, but also because they were free labor. Like students didn't have. Students are committed. They're committed in school. It's not like they have infinite amounts of time, but they don't have families and other responsibilimes that eat their leisure time in the same way. And so they are,
and also rent was cheaper. The things that sustain us were cheaper. You could pick up jobs almost like that, right? Like it is a completely different context to what we have now.
Well, it's funny when people are like now trying to do 70s style stalking today, and I'm like, that didn't work when the job market was wide open and no one did background checks. I don't know what you think it's going to do when they can just look your name up and see that you're in KeyWiki.
It's almost crazy that Mark Rudd ended up becoming like a maths teacher. Like,
yes,
Mark Rudd. I mean, technically, I like Mark Rudd, and I like his memoir and all that sort of stuff. And I'm kind of like a Weather Underground stan, but like the fact that he was able to become a maths teacher. Absolutely ludicrous. The job market in a capitalist society should make sure that they prevent people who are like obviously terrorists from teaching kids maths. Because what are they going to teach them? The maths to make a bomb.
I mean, maybe. I mean, it is. It is. I mean, it's also funny how much. Like all those people ended up as academics, like the education project being so tied into, and I'm not. You're a soft Weather Underground stand. I am not a, but I am notorious for being like, what did they do? Like spread STIs and blow themselves up? Like,
sign me up.
But I was like, they're one of the only groups I know of that has a bombing campaign whose main casualty is themselves.
Well, no, in the defense of the Weather Underground, that's because they did turn away from bombings that would have human casualties.
I know.
Later on,
they weren't big on. Despite their actionism, they actually weren't that big on killing people. So.
And Prairie Fire is still kind of like an interesting document to read about from the time. I mean, I'm not going to like try to recreate what they were doing, but I mean, it was certainly like when you were in SDS at the time, it was one of the possible avenues.
The other one was becoming a Bobavakianite or becoming a Draperite or Hal Draperite Trotskyist. Those are the ones that didn't happen.
And at least with the Weather Underground, you're able to be like on the top 10 FBI most wanted list, right? It comes with a certain degree of like street cred. Whereas I don't think that unfortunately, people aren't making documentaries about the Draconites or the Avakian disciples.
Although there is a body count with with both of them getting killed and then getting in gunfights that that exists for the Avakianites.
Well, in a very Coen's brothers way, I think.
Yeah. I find all this, I will say this: one of the greatest gifts of the Avakianites from the SCS, though, is a bunch of like California Democrats with like radical street cred from the 70s who just became normal neoliberals in the aughts and aught teens, like Gene Kwan, the former mayor of Oakland. Because I was like, yeah, not only was she associated with Maoists, she was associated with the most radical Maoist faction in California. And she just became a normie Democrat. So Van Jones was not the first. He was in a long tradition. And I guess, okay, this is I think one of the areas, to get back to the subject of your book, I think this is why.
Oh, my book. I keep on forgetting about the book. Buy the book.
But why these cultural Marxist conspiracies have so much catchway with leftists and former leftists? I mean, I really do think that it's because they see this history and they're like, look at the SDS, look at these radical Maoists. And then, like, by the time I'm a kid during Occupy, or I was in my 30s, I wasn't a kid, but like, these people are like key figures in the Democratic Party. Fucking Robert Reich has SDS/Bavavakianite ties. Like, it's just crazy to know that. Like,
can I go on about Robert Reich for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Him and William Lind went to college together, and William Lind fucking hated his guts. Like, William Lind was the editor of the Conservative Student Society magazine, and there's a whole issue devoted to how much they fucking hated Robert Reich. And what's even more ironic is that William Lind and Robert Reich ended up working together for Gary Hart on Capitol Hill. And I just keep on thinking, like, what was that office environment like of just these two guys who fucking hated each other as students, just sort of being office buddies or being office collaborators or things like that. And so,
to me, that says also everything you need to know about the Clinton administration, because Gary Hart is the Clinton administration's like founding father in a lot of ways of the Party Democrats.
No, he's one of those. One of those sort of inspirations for the Democrats of the leisure class. What is that? Democratic Leadership Committee that Clinton was part of, and so it's kind of totally understandable that William S. Lind was like a staffer for Graham Hart. And part of that whole sort of turn towards the right that had happened sort of from Goldwater onwards.
But also weirdly would give him the grounds. Would give Lynn the grounds to say, like, look at people like Robert Reich. The Marxists just entered our society culturally. And took over the Democratic Party. I mean, even though he's working with them in the same administration. And by the way, when people like, this is way more common than people realize, like Tom Holman and Gungino and all these people who were actually even part of the Obama administration. It's just like, because Bovino, excuse me, not Gungino. I'm like, they were Obama important to these guys. Like the whole like political apparatus being somewhat depoliticized most of the time means that these people are often working together under Democratic administrations because the reactionaries tend to be in the military. And I find it fascinating because it does seem to be this real core. And I like what your book does in kind of proving. I mean, we could talk about the more crazy ends of this, like Adorno as a secret Beatle, or
which admittedly, the one article of mine that gets the most comments out of all of them is the article where I'm talking about the Adorno as Beatles, as the secret songwriter of the Beatles. There is something in like the conspiracy subculture that's sort of obviously tied to InfoWars and all of those different other kind of subcultures too, that is really committed to this idea of Adorno as the person who is like really sort of inventing not only what one author calls Beatle music rock, but also punk rock.
Yeah. Punk rock, which historically was famous for doing stuff like wearing swastikas on their arm in the 70s. Anyway, and has like punk rock being associated with the left wing is like a weird post 80s phenomenon. It's like it's not even all that true of the initial punk rock movement.
And there's a lot of debates about that in the UK too, but because I mean, like the classic opposition between the Sex Pistols and the Clash, and how people in conservative magazines will then sort of very recently say things like turf is the new punk rock, sort of being transphobic as punk. And will write those articles. Well, the Clash weren't really punk because they didn't have the same kind of history as the Sex Pistols, despite the Sex Pistols largely being a sort of kind of marketing operation in a way,
right? And really only having working class street poet because they hired a psychopath to be their basis. I mean, I think this is actually somewhat interesting to think about the way the right works on this, though, because they're both denouncing the I mean, we see this in two ways. One is something that Daniel Bell, a conservative, I may add, said in the 1950s, that there's this weird valorization in conservative circles of family values while also promoting reforms to Fordist capitalism, which undermined the family. And he started, I mean, he was talking about this as early as the late 50s.
He was also at the book launch party of The Authoritarian Personality from the Frankfurt School.
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me.
As a correspondent, yeah.
But at the same token, today, when you hear these people complain about like what's killing the family, and I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I think it's become very obvious under Trump, in a way that can't be denied, because you had like Josh Harley and those people talking about family supportive policies, and then as soon as you get into office, they gut everything to funnel stuff into the military industrial complex on a scale that we haven't seen since World War II, actually. And it's the opposite of what they were promising, with Hawley and to some degree even Marjorie Taylor Greene and those people. So it's become a little bit obvious that populist appeal doesn't really work. I mean, one of the things I find funny, actually, the way in which the right mirrors the left in a different way, is whenever they get all Bonapartist and attach themselves to a singular figure, if that figure gets two terms, you're almost always going to deal with the fact he's going to betray everything he said he supported by you. And I'm like, that also happens to us. I mean, not so much in America, but like, because like, they don't even get that far. But like Mitterrand in France, or Miliband. I also, I mean, I don't know what Corbyn would have been like as a leader, although our party is not a good indication of what his actual politics would have ended up looking like.
It's not our party, it's your party, which is the most confusing name, because everyone is sort of saying your party, and I'm like, well, my party, I'm actually part of anti-capitalist resistance, and that's not really a party, that's more of a group. So it just becomes very confusing in conversations. But it was voted for by most of the people at conference. So yeah, your party is not only just the most confusing name, but also an opportunity to show that the failure of Corbynism wasn't just necessarily the fact that he was attacked by the right-wing press, and actually there was limitations of the project Corbynism within the Labour Party itself.
Yeah, and apparently also outside of it. So, I find, I agree with you on that. By the way, I have always been on. Well, I am controversially on Corbynism. Also, Empower would have hit hard walls because what he was promising would be really hard to do in the current economic environment, and I don't know how he was really planning on. I don't know how you reindustrialize an island that was priorly industrialized due to being an empire. Like, I don't know. It's hard to do, particularly when you're not an imperialist. And
also there's a lot of faith placed in the green transition to be that reindustrializing force when it actually won't. And reckoning with that is actually quite important, I think. And it will
no,
also.
I agree.
Well,
like when people talk about the Green New Deal, go ahead.
And will also lead to problems for Zach Polanski, who is now like on the Corbyn 2.0. I think that although it is a sign of, basically a lot of not only British politics but also British social organising is now wrapped around the imperative to kind of try to keep the right out. And I think that the example of what has happened on the American left about trying to keep Trump out shows that if that is your main objective, then it's just going to actually create problems down the line and actually not lead to the building of a sustainable and sort of reliable organization for forcing historical change.
Oh, I would you on that. I think that the problem that you have is like you end up with a populist or at best a popular front coalition that also is, as soon as it attains power, is at war with itself. Because it doesn't have any real programmatic unity to tie it together beyond the opposition. So the moment that you win, your modus operandi for any unity immediately falls apart. And that, I don't know why it seems to always favor the right wing of Labor or the Democrats or the Social Democrats or forever, but somehow it seems to structurally always favor the right wing of that. When that happens, I mean, like, I can't think of an example when it favors the left wing of that and falling out. So, I just, it's something that I think about, but I do think about this. You know, we've been talking a lot today about. I want to go back to the right wing element of this because we've been talking a lot today about how these get a lot of former leftists. Like, I do like when you look at, for example, post-left Marxism, which I'm going to be very specific because it's like the third form of post-leftism that has existed. It is really not that Marxist, but also very different from the anarchist post-left of the 1990s, which was also given to right-wing infiltration. Troy Southgate, the former National Front leader, somehow got into the California anarchist scene. Through post-left anarchism. But in general, post-leftism has also picked up on a lot of these cultural Marxist conspiracy theories and also tied them to weirder stuff, which is like tying them to French ultra-left negationism and stuff like that, which has led to some truly bizarre scenarios where you meet people who are like Stalin adjacent, but also believe in negationism, which, by the way, its original logic was to negate the need for the Popular Front by saying the Holocaust either was inevitable or didn't happen, depending on which version of it you take up. And that has moved all kinds of ultra leftists to the right before. I mean, when people look at this and they always go Trotskyist are where this comes from, because that's the other form of cultural Marxism, is it's all Trotskyist fault. And they all, the reality is, like, you mentioned David, yeah, but the reality is when you like see like David Horowitz, for example, he was a Maoist. Like, he was a Maoist with ties to the Panthers, and thinks with, I'm not sure. I've actually looked at the evidence and I can't say. He thinks that somebody in the Panthers executed somebody he put there, who got murdered. And that was his beginning of becoming a rabid right-wing lunatic. Or if you look at the case of France, like, I think a lot of the post-68 French right, they're almost all Maoist, former Maoist. I mean, even people like Bernard Levy, which is nuts. So, you know, but let's talk about the right-wing appeal to this, because we talked about like what Breitbart did. We talked about the way that the Breitbart was able to merge this into the Tea Party and then get that out into conservative punditry. Now it's ubiquitous. I mean, it is almost weirdly like the alt-right is interesting because Trumpism basically killed it, but a lot of its ideas were actually liquidated into Trumpism.
Yeah.
Even if it as a movement was killed by Trump, ironically. I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, I kind of find it interesting. I think that's part of why Fuentes is trying to pivot away from Trump now, is because, I mean, part of it might be sincere. It's hard to know, because that man is trolling on a level that most of us don't even comprehend. Because sometimes I'm like, wait, is he trolling himself? I don't know. And he also does the thing that a lot of these people in the cultural Marxists do, and I'm not saying he does that actually as much, because he just rather blame the Jews outright. It doesn't need any cultural Marxist baggage for that. But what he does this thing where he sounds reasonable, brings up true things in the beginning, and then bait and switch, and all of a sudden you're down like a rabbit hole where like Western culture has been under assault since, I don't know, forever. Probably because of Jews. You know, I mean, I haven't heard this, but he might even complain about Hadrian not killing enough Jews or something. So like because they go back that far. I find this interesting to deal with today, because I do think your book is timely, and I don't think this is Rock Hill. I want to be very clear. I don't think this is Gabriel Rock Hill with Dominico Lacerda primarily. We're in a moment where reality is so openly corrupt, and there's so many actual conspiracies that are just like happening in broad fucking daylight. And not just in the US, but I mean, the Epstein files is a truly transnational affair. That, however, it's leading to widespread rapid paranoia and a declining of demands for evidence, because so much of evidence is obscured and so much corruption seems obvious, that you just seen people like, there are leftists right now who make a living doing parapolitical stuff where they claim that everything, including the Charlie Kirk assassination, is identical to Israel. And then you have leftists who are sharing Professor Zhang, who is literally doing Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy talk. Like, cleaned up of I mean, he does the Candace Owens thing of bringing the Frankists, but I was like, I now am seeing some leftists take seriously stuff that is explicitly post-fascist conspiracy thing, not just through cultural Marxism talk or LaRoucheism or MAGA communism or any of that, but also because they're like, oh, this is just Clio dynamics. No, Peter Turchin is not Professor Zhang. And this and that. And I'm seeing this being ubiquitous. So I'm thinking we're going to see a lot more cultural Marxism conspiracies. And I also think we're going to see a lot of people even trying to break down. I think there's going to be a new form of opportunism where like people try to glom on to these conspiracy chains, because they're also super lucrative right now in a way that they haven't been. I mean, like, you used to be, you could support like one Alex Jones becoming a millionaire this way, but like right now it seems like it's the main way to get media variety and attention. If you look at like in America, the top podcasts are all basic. I mean, Tucker Carlson isn't really, but he kind of is because he's also one of these cultural Marxist conspiracy guys. But like Candace Owens is doing just straight up like batshit conspiracy monger and stuff that makes early Alex Jones look kind of tame, which is impressive. And we haven't got to like reptilians and shit, but it's impressive.
No, I often feel kind of nostalgic for the conspiracy culture of the early 2000s because this is when like I got onto the internet. And like, you know, it was all sort of Bohemian Grove stuff and sort of like, like the elites do all these sort of weird satanic rituals and, you know, they're hiding things in Area 51. And again, now it is sort of like, did you know that Erica Kirk cheated on Charlie Kirk before they got married and after they got married as well? And I mean, there was this sort of weird porousness between, I guess,
celebrity gossip culture and
gossip culture and conspiracy culture, right?
And like Raelians, like or reptilians. Excuse me, not Raelians. But yeah, like because you have in Candace Owens, you have a collapsing of that, or like, and even there's even leftists who I've broken with who said, "Oh, we don't have a reason to disbelieve this, so we're going to start pushing that Charlie Kirk was killed by Mossad as a way to oppose Israel." And I'm like, that's absurd. Like, if you think that Taylor Robinson's the one who did it, there's no way. Like, what you think that they did that Mossad happened to find the one former libertarian kid who fell in love with their trans roommate a year ago and was totally apolitical, but happened to be a hunter from southern Utah where you train at 200 yards on regular and just happened to have a hunting rifle. And by the way, that Mauser they use, which I was able to call what it was from the bullet with it, was like, "Oh, you have to be a sniper." That's not a sniper rifle. It is just a rifle barreled hunter rifle. You don't know what you're talking about.
I remember listening to This Is Revolution broadcast after the Charlie Kirk killing, and you were possibly the only person who was actually kind of accurately describing what had probably happened. Right. Because it was sort of like it's Utah. These kids are taught how to hunt from a very early age. That's actually quite an easy shot.
It's not that hard of a shot.
It requires like a whole secret service to be involved in. It just takes one person to sort of like think Charlie Kirk is a dick, and to like end up shooting him.
Right, and I mean, there are weirdnesses about the story. I'm not gonna lie, but I have been like, it's fairly easy to explain. A 200-yard shot for people who are used to hunting in the desert, in specific, with rifled, with properly rifled caliber guns. Yeah, that's not that hard. I can make it. Like, and I got tower guard training. I've never seen a sniper rifle, like a true sniper rifle, in my life. I've just been trained on a regular old fucking high caliber bolt action. And it's just, I think it's a problem that both the left and the right, I mean the right, it's actually more embarrassing when they say this shit, because I'm like, you guys are supposed to know guns. Like, that's your thing. But it's been weird, and it's been weird watching leftists and rightists pick up the same talking points from literally Candace Owens. It's been bizarre, because I'm like, wait, why are we trying to save the reputation of Charlie Kirk? Like, I don't see how it's such a weird thing. And what's also weird is it's also become culturally not relevant already somehow. But we say this the day after there may or may not have been an assassination attempt on the president yesterday. I say may not because someone got a gun into the White House Correspondents' dinner lobby and got killed. We don't know.
Yeah, but I mean,
more.
I mean, it's a mark of the times that at this point was sort of like, well, it's another assassination, another assassination attempt, or
yeah. Although I will say, a lot of people grew up in the one time period in American history where there wasn't a lot of assassinations attempts. Because if you look at anything before Reagan's assassination attempt back, you're like, there's like an assassination attempt like every couple of months.
Yeah. No, it's actually quite normal for you guys to have a presidential assassination attempt.
Yeah, it's like it's an American tradition. Weirdly, like it didn't happen to Isaac. It didn't happen to the World War II presidents. Although it did happen to FDR before World War II. But like from basically JFK forward, and also from Wilson backwards, until you get to like Lincoln, it's super common. So it's interesting, but yeah, it's crazy that we're depending on how you count with Trump, this is the third or fourth attempt. And also when you actually discover who's trying to do it, the ideologies of the people out to get Trump are like all over the place.
Totally.
I'm not going to say that none of them are leftist, but like it's a lot less than you would have thought. So I bring this up because you know what I promise you, there are a lot of people who went off about conspiracy cultures around the Trump assassination over the summer of 2024, and that was become very common on like blue, what we colloquially call blue MAGA, our Democrat Make America Great Again world, which we also didn't blue on after they all came up with conspiracies about how that was planned. And I'm like, there's no way, unless he didn't get hit in the ear, there's no way to be precise enough to at that distance with an AR, not a rifle barreled gun or a sniper rifle, to just graze someone's ear on purpose. That like that's way too, because the exact head trajectory is so precise. And yet you saw that pretty common. And I guess my point is, do you think we're going to see a lot more of this? Since I think we're seeing conspiracy, like mainstream American culture right now is conspiracy culture, period. And it kind of has been for long. I mean, like, if you think about it in the 1990s, before, I don't know if you know about American television. It was all conspiracy shit all the time. It's just it wasn't politicized. So
No, don't worry. I have my partner grew up in America in the 90s, and the 80s too. So she's more than familiar with how conspiratorial American culture was. She also grew up in the Michigan militia and knew Timothy McVeigh, but that's like a whole different episode.
So, funnily enough, my wife grew up around that. But yeah, and I grew up around the actual Third Klan being a thing that was actually a problem for my wife.
Not hell yeah. I mean, just sort of like, okay, that's interesting. That's what I meant. Not sort of
but like in the 90s and aughts, the Klan was actually bigger in the Midwest, but in the 80s, it was still a major thing in the South. The thing is, though, like it was the Third Klan, which the Second Klan was like some weird racist, vaguely terrorist multi-level marketing scheme. The First Klan was just like a post-war terror organization. And then the Third Klan is weird because it's not really either the first or the second Klan, but it's like a quasi-neo-Nazi organization that really came into being in the 70s. And went back to being mostly racial because the second Klan was actually weirdly, specifically anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic. As much or more than it was. I mean, it was also anti-Black, but believe it or not, that wasn't its primary concern. Whereas the First Klan was just basically a lynching terror organization. Anyway, the reasons why I bring this up is like David Duke was like a real political viability in like the 80s and 90s in the Southeast.
Well, I mean, in 92, he was one of the Republican candidates, right? He ran against Bush and Buchanan.
And, Bush, Buchanan, Pat Robertson, and David Duke. If you think about that, you're like, no wonder Bush won. Holy shit. But the other thing that it also brings out is like this idea that the GOP being full of these like far right reactionaries being new. That's not true. That's a post-Reagan phenomenon. Maybe even a post-Goldwater phenomenon. Even though Goldwater didn't like these guys, it's probably a post-Goldwater phenomenon, to be honest.
No, I totally agree. Like you read interviews with Goldwater in the 70s, and he comes out seeming quite moderate in the context of his time. And you see that even now. I mean, like I remember. I mean, the anecdotal example I have of is when Liz Truss, the UK Prime Minister, put forward this like severely sort of neoliberal mini budget, and her chancellor, which is sort of the main economic position in the British government, got replaced by Jeremy Hunt, and he was presented as this sort of moderate conservative, which was very funny for me because like when I was a teenager and I was like participating in like student protests in the early 2010s, Jeremy Hunt's like this absolutely rabid neoliberal, this rabid sort of right-wing figure. And so it's like very common for people in right-wing parties before a rightward shift to then eventually position themselves as the more moderate voice in the party. And I think this is what happened to Goldwater, because a lot of the people who supported Goldwater and was really fighting for his presidential campaign ended up just sort of getting gradually more radical over the course of the 60s and the 70s, to the point where they end up forming the new right. And I feel like we are jumping back and forward in my book, but this is like the point of recording is like 2.5 hours in. So if you're here, you're a real Varn head, which is what I do consider myself. So yeah, like if you're a real Varn head, thank you for coming along with on this journey, and stay with us.
Yeah, I would. I mean, we can start wrapping it down, but I do think it's interesting to note this element of like conservative fusionism has always had this element of people who are often the initiators being more moderate figures. I will say that people try to do this with Reagan, but to do it with Reagan, they have to ignore huge parts of, like, liberals were really doing this against Trump. I remember that, like going back and quoting Reagan against him, but then like ignoring other crazy shit Reagan believed, because Reagan gets a clean up from everybody historically, and I'm like, no, he believes some really nutty shit. And his like stuff about AIDS is real hard to forgive. Basically, if C. Everett Koop hadn't undermined him, he would have just let everybody die. And I think that's like really, you know, so I want to be careful with saying washing prior conservatives, but I do think what's interesting is like when like Sam Tannenhouse went off about like how Goldwater would find the Bush administration insanely radical. And we're, you know, and today people will talk about the Bush administration as moderate compared to Trump. And I'm like, well, there's a right-wing just drift that happens because Goldwater wasn't a bircher. But in making alliances with them, which he did through people like Phyllis Schlafly, the birchers really came to dominate the movement conservatism in a lot of ways, which means conspiracy culture was always just a scratch away. And it wasn't like the William S. Lynn nice cultural Marxism. It was Judeo-Bolshevism outright.
Yeah, I'm going to say, and also what's kind of interesting about the LaRoucheite right-wing term is that some of the more influential figures within the organization were reading Bircherite literature and sort of
Mhm.
linking it with SDS's critiques of corporate liberalism. And so they were trying to find a way to fuse those two critiques of, one, a study of, essentially the security state that formed in the post-war era,
Mhm.
that was also quite markedly anti-communist, with a critique of that society that was also anti-communist in its same way, but in a conspiratorial sense of sort of saying, Eisenhower is part of a secret plan to turn to overthrow the American Republic.
Right.
And so sort of points of convergence between the left and the right are often there around like a critique of establishment liberalism,
Mhm.
but coming at from two different directions. And there are certain organizations at certain moments that end up landing on that ground, and really running with it.
Mm. Yeah, that is a crazy place to end up being, because what you end up having is this weird like hybrid of the far right's conspiracy culture with elements of the left's conspiracy culture. And frankly, the left's conspiracy culture is more viable. And what is interesting about that, though, is like that doesn't begin with LaRouche. Like the Birchers explicitly modeled themselves on what they view. Like it's actually on a parody of Leninist democratic centralism. It's what they thought it was, not what it actually was. But they modeled themselves as Leninists. Like one of the weird things you see, and I think you see this in Chris Rufo to some degree, although he's moving away from it now because I think he's getting tired.
Well, no, he's a hipster pretending to be a conservative. That is my thesis about Chris Rufo till the day I die.
But isn't that a shit ton of millennial conservatives? Is there basically? I mean, they even dress like hipsters. They all look like Brooklyn boys from 2008. But
well, I mean, the thing is that they're desperate to maintain their taste in music, their taste in film, their taste in art, but they have to move in these conservative circles where they have to sort of shed that, and that's not really who they are. And they kind of like are bored of hanging out with conservatives and just sort of want to hang out with leftists, I think. And this is sort of what I find as
you
the
see this in Times Square
Rufus.
too.
Yeah. Oh, totally. Yeah, entirely.
I mean, half of them are like former leftists who still miss the hip coolness of being a leftist in Brooklyn, but want their reactionary politics to somehow meld with that. And it only kind of sort of works. But go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the total undercurrent of like Chris Rufo's work, which in a way kind of echoes William F. Buckley's stuff, because they just want to kind of be invited to the dinner party of liberals, and they are desperate for the approval of liberals, but they can't get it because they are the nasty conservative.
Yeah, and so they get tired of it, but the conspiracy culture stuff seems to overlap with them in some strange way. And one of the things I tell you that I always find interesting, I don't always believe the liberal refrain that every accusation is a confession, because I think historically that's actually not normally true. It does seem to be kind of true for the Trump administration. But with a lot of these, what's interesting with a lot of these like Gramsciite interpretations of paleoconservatism is they want to do what they think the cultural Marxists did. Like their obsession with the university at a time when the university is becoming less and less culturally relevant in the United States.
That
is totally them thinking that's how, if they can only pull off what they think the New Left did. And my point is, like, the New Left didn't actually pull that off. So one of the ironies about this is, like, it really is a confession of what they want to do. Like, they really want a conspiracy of cultural elites to, like, come over and drive culture and move politics that way. And that's, when they say culture, like, all politics is downstream of culture, like
Mm-hmm.
which Breitbart said.
Mm-hmm.
Although I don't think he's where it comes from. I think it's actually older than that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's from Limbaugh.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in a skewed way. Yeah.
But
Who's actually talking about what Gramsci thought he would thought he was doing?
right.
So we have the sort of Limbaugh version of Gramsci happening right now.
Right. And it's just crazy because the one thing I would say is like, well, Gramsci didn't like, I'm not saying Gramsci wouldn't work if we actually did what he said, but whatever the Euro-communist liberal interpretation of Gramsci was, sure as hell it worked for us. Like, it's not like,
Well,
it's not like,
you continue. You finish the point.
No, I find it interesting that in some ways I'm glad that they're obsessed with this stuff because it gives them bad strategies.
Yeah.
But I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, it also ends up being like Rockhill's strategy too. I mean, like there is that clip from like the sort of right-wing investigators of like, oh, here's this scary Marxist professor saying this thing, and what Rockhill says is that we should use the universities as a base of operations to spread our ideas, but also set up like para-academic institutions. And I remember watching that and going, well, this is just like new left shit. This is exactly what they wrote about in like the Port of Huron statement, and it failed, and it is representative of the kind of Western Marxism that he critiques. And even when you get to like a conclusion of who paid the pipers of Western Marxism, there is no kind of strategy or no kind of identification of the agent of social change, which, to compare it to like the original sort of like debates about Marcuse being a CIA agent and its impact on the left, it was actually kind of a proxy war about different types of strategy of how to organize, right? And what is absent in like Rockhill is kind of like what the strategy is, or what the real revolutionary subject is, and so you're left with sort of what is kind of like a left-wing canon wars argument of like, we shouldn't read Adorno and Marcuse, we should just read Lenin and Thomas Sankara instead, which is fine, but it's essentially like Rockhill setting us a different syllabus.
Right.
And that's sort of kind of what the right ends up doing. Of sort of, well, we should read not just Gramsci, but like sort of a right wing version of Gramsci through Limbaugh. But we should do what it's all just sort of a recommendation for reading recommendations, I guess.
Right. And this is true, and they've been trying to do this for a long time. I mean, like, one of the things I can tell you about Reagan movement conservatism that actually came out of the Birchers, but really was pushed by the Reagan administration, is they would have everyone read Saul Ascolinsky as like the primary enemy, but also as their model for doing community organizing.
Well, this is the case with the Tea Party too, right?
Right. Yeah, they were still. Oh, yeah, they were still making Akolinsky references, which is another thing, because Obama's, coming through the university when he comes through, it means he's taught by a former New Leftist, and he worked under an Akolinsky model, and I'm just like, oh, so Akolinsky, who made us all liberal somehow. It's just, I find it very interesting because, on one hand, it's flat. I mean, on one of the hands, it's flattering the leftists because, like, oh, if we could actually pull off a conspiracy of this caliber, what else could we have done? And actually, why would we have stopped with the culture if we could have got away with this? Oh, if you think one of the things I remember is like everyone tell me how radical the universities are. They were the most radical hostile place I've ever worked. They were leftist, but like if you were particularly in the aughts, if you were an actual Marxist, like when I had converted to Marxism by the end of my graduate school, right? And I was a fucking pariah, like even more than when I was a conservative, which was also bad for graduate school. But there,
well, I mean, even being in a quote unquote cultural Marxist department, right? Like I went to the school, the Center for the Study of Theory and Criticism. Like this
The
is
Cultural Marxist School.
the Cultural Marxist School. And if you did any political work, like people would look down on you, right? Like you're not supposed to be doing that. You're supposed to be reading books. You're supposed to be actually doing like the work of becoming a scholar. And so the idea that sort of in any way that critical theory radicalizes people into becoming activists is kind of untrue. But when you look at the places that are supposed to be like the purest critical theory centers, I mean, where it comes down to, I mean, cultural Marxism is essentially a theory of like there are no issues in the world. The only issues that are produced by the only social antagonisms, the only sort of political conflicts are produced by the fact that people are exposed to this theory from the Frankfurt School, which gets it totally the wrong way around. The fact that people are maybe sometimes drawn to the work of the Frankfurt School or drawn to the work of people who are influenced by the critical theory tradition is because they are facing sort of problems in their daily life, and sometimes they have the opportunities to, I mean, come to a more holistic explanation about what causes them.
Well, I really want to pick up on this a little bit. There's two places I kind of wanted to end the thing off. Maybe we'll do both, but one of them is this point. Is off, like I remember basically going like seeing that Rock Hill clip that was picked up by Canary Mission and going like he just wants to do the Long March of the Academy again, but like more Marxist Lenin-y this time, except that you forget that it was Marxist Lenin-y in the 70s. Like a lot of those people became Maoists before they went and became just lame Democratic Party adjacent academics. The other thing I found interesting is like for all the complaints about Trotskyites and all that, I'll give Rockhill this. He doesn't tie it into anti-Trotsky conspiracies, but then I'm like, why aren't you talking about what the sectarian groups were doing and how they related to these theorists are not just mentioning that these theorists existed and may have taken and probably did take money downstream of intelligence operations. Like I do think like you do actually have to do the proving that it isn't just the court, and it's this weird thing that I find like okay, so I'll put it to you this way. I feel where I'm arguing about Gabriel Rockhill, I often feel the same way as when I'm talking to people about China, which is ironic given Gabriel Rockhill's concerns. But when I talk to people who are outside of Marxist circles and say stupid shit about China, I sound like the most China defensive person on the planet. But when I talk about like, have they achieved socialism yet? And I'm like, they don't even claim that. I don't know what you're doing. I mean, they kind of claimed it in the 1982 Constitution, but then like read every Politburo speech after like 96. It's always like we're pushing out the necessary social reforms to achieve the first, the socialism truly, and I think now it's 2050. Like, and I'm like, you're carrying more water than even they carry. And so similar with Rockhill, when I talk to people who just want to condemn him as a conspiracy theorist, I'm like, he's not that.
No. Totally not.
But I do think he's weirdly like, I don't want to say he's idealist because it's overabused, but maybe a little bit, in so much that he really seems to think it's about the ideas consumed and not the material conditions in which they are consumed in, just like you say. And I've thought about this in terms of like the other popular thing that cultural Marxism would sometimes get tied on, and this was from the Alan Woods types, that they would like talk about cultural Marxism and postmodernism and like blame it for the degeneration of the left. And I would be like, well, why did post-Marxism emerge out of Eurocommunism in the first place? And if you read like Baudrillard's The Divine Left, where he's just ranting about how the communists aren't differentiating themselves from Mitterrand as Mitterrand's betraying them. Like, oh, this is a response to people who feel burned by these communist parties not doing what they promised they do. And then them coming up with a theory that somehow like abandons Marxism in some weird ass way. I mean, and that seems to be driving what is happening more than the other way around. It's not that the post-Marxist and post-structuralists came in and ruined Marxism. It's that because Marxism was in disarray, these ideas had some purchase at all. And that's always been my response to Rockhillites. And I've even talked to Colin Bodell, who's Rockhill's student and like his defender. And I'm like, I'm not saying, you know, I've talked to Daniel Tutt about this too. I was like, I'm not saying that everything Rockhill's saying is false. I'm not saying that Western Marxist academics weren't often influenced by the CIA. And we definitely should be interested, even if they weren't the origins of the ideas, why they were promoting them. But at the same token, like, this explains so little to me about like what actually happened in the 70s, because if there weren't these other organizational and material problems, like if the march back into the factories hadn't failed, if the students as a new revolutionary subject hadn't failed, if,
or radicals in the professions, that strategy, which is like the PMC strategy, right?
Yeah, that failed. Our just normal old sectarian Marxist Leninism didn't do that well either. Like, because it wasn't like they completely went away. In fact, they had a rebirth after the New Left, ironically. The CPUSA's highest growth rate after the Popular Front, and they hit their height of like between 80 and 90K. I've seen two different numbers there. In 48, and then they dropped down by 5 years into the Red Scare to 5,000. Their biggest growth rate again is like 73 to 76. Like during the Angela Davis period that we're talking about. Like, then they got back up probably to 20K again, and they might be that big now. It's no one knows. The CPUSA is not open about its numbers. It used to be, but it's not now. No one knows. Like, but at the same token, like, if the issue is this cultural Marxism, why is the height of a lot of these Marxist Leninist orgs actually after that, not before it? I mean, like, if you look at the second heights, because the other thing is, you can't say the reason why Marxism got smashed in the 60s wasn't academics, it was blacklisting. Like, it was the third Red Scare, or the fourth Red Scare, or the second Red Scare, depending on how you count.
I also people just being turned off by like going to protests or things like that, and being like heavily repressed by the police.
Oh yeah, that too.
And I think that the constituency that at that point the left mobilization was drawing from, the degree to which you could go to a protest and still feel safe was very limited. In comparison to what it felt like earlier on in the 60s.
Oh yeah, that was because the police repression was up, and also like leaders were being killed. I mean, just straight up. I mean, like, another thing that we miss is like how many left assassinations were in the 60s. I mean, like, we know about Hampton and stuff like that, but like there was a ton of them.
Oh yeah.
Some of them were right-wingers going after leftists. Some of them were usually local police being called in by the feds, and the local police doing the actual shooting, because the feds tended not to do that. It's always unclear to me when I read the papers if the feds are actually mad that the local police did it. Sometimes they seem like they are, and sometimes they seem like they set it up because they're like, well, the local yokels will do the dirty work because they're dumb. But there's so much of that in the 70s. I mean, a lot of people did get disappeared. And then when you look at that in the terms of the 80s, and like not so much in America, where it was, although you did have stuff like the Move bombing, where they literally bombed a fucking neighborhood. But if you look at what was happening like outside of Western Europe and the United States, I mean, people were being disappeared in mass. So, you know, when we talk about this, you know, and like I mentioned earlier, also like I don't know, maybe the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnamese were at war, and it was a proxy war between China and the Soviet Union, and maybe that was really fucking stuff up for people. I don't know. Like seems like that would be a big deal. It's I think this just gets glossed over in these debates about like cultural Marxism or the Frankfurt School. And so, like I said, like when I'm talking to people who just hate Rockhill, I always want to be like, he's not really a conspiracy theorist. There's proof about what he's saying. But when I'm talking to people who are like his fans and like, it explains everything, and Western Marxism was all a CIA invention, it was all cooked at Langley, and I was like, that's not even what he says. But on the right, okay, let's I want to talk about James Lindsay and Michael Lewin and all this because
of course,
because the contemporary and I mentioned Arun McIntyre, who's maybe the smartest of the bunch, but even like critical theories out of Coulette, for example, which was not explicitly cultural Marxist, but was like James Lindsay 1.0. What James Lindsay does is take all this stuff and then he adds it with Eric von Kuhnlinden's, who was this German
no, I'm aware.
Who was the imitating the eschaton guy. And he combines cultural Marxism with that, and then McGee's thesis about Hegel being hermetic. And like now not only are we all cultural Marxists, we're also all Gnostics. And this is like a great spiritual battle, which is also weird because James Lindsay's a fucking new atheist, or at least he was. And
less and less by the day, like he is sort of presenting himself as a sort of Christian conservative more and more, but that's partially because of. I mean, there are some people who explain it as that because of his sponsorship, largely coming from Christian conservatives.
I always thought this was interesting because you see this with Peterson too, where Peterson is like promoting hardcore Christian values, but if you ask him if he believes in God, he gives you this postmodern gobbledygook that makes no sense.
Well, it's the whole cultural Christianity turn. How a lot of conservatives have now expressed sort of at least conservative sympathies, if not have expressed Christian sympathies, if not Christian beliefs. And we've had this whole debate in England about, like, whether church attendance is increasing among young people or not. And
in America, subjectively not. But go ahead.
Well, no, and one person who's part of this debate put it quite succinctly is that I would rather that people didn't turn to Christianity because it's good, but rather because it's true. And she was really picking up on the point that now Christianity is trying to be implemented as like a disciplining mechanism of sort of live these certain ways, rather than you're actually forgiven by Christ's sacrifice for you, which is what Christianity is in a way entirely about. But also it's also, not to entirely loop it back to the subject of my book, but like it's very LaRouchian, because LaRouchian is like, no, what Christianity is all about is because you're created by God, you should be like morally good. It's not that you are a sinner and that Jesus has like taken that sacrifice upon himself, and that
LaRouchian is a Platonist heretic, actually. I mean, seriously. I mean, like I one of the things I have actually told it, and I started at the Boise conference, you might remember this. I started telling people to be like, why don't you hold these people to Orthodox Christian standards to prove that they are full of shit?
I do remember this.
I was talking to a postmodern Christian who like doesn't even really believe in God, and Rollins is a good guy. I like him.
Of course.
But he was like, but that's not what I'm concerned with. And I'm like, but my point is they're claiming to believe in something that they clearly don't. it's easy to hit them on this, and show, you know, I mean, how little this is. And yeah, we have the same debates on church attendance and young people, except the stats really do back up that like Gen Z is the least religious.
Any argument about church revivals is not backed up by like even on the ground statistics.
No, they seem to be they seem to be vibes based off social media for juked algorithms, and then like then also when you like look at what they're actually doing and saying, you're like, these people don't know anything about, like, you have tradcasts who don't know a single thing about the Catholic Church. Like, I know more than they do, and it's deeply embarrassing to actual traditional Christians. And so I find this interesting. I also so I feel that like cultural Marxism is a way to like have your cake and eat it too for these people. Because you'd be like, oh, look at the Marxist war on the church and all this cultural liberalism, but like we're not really going to create a society where people go back to church though. Like, I mean, if you look at like what like, and liberals freak out about, and I really do think there's like almost a feedback loop, because liberals freak out about Christian nationalism, and like the cases of Hegseth, that's real. At the same time, it's like, but outside of these weirdos, it's actually a very dying tradition. Whereas when I was growing up in the 1980s, it was so default, you didn't even bring it up. Like, so yeah, I find these quite fascinating, and it's kind of a big problem for us to deal with in a coherent way. We've been going we now hit 3 hours, and I knew that you and I talking might go this way because we're both obsessed with a lot of the same shit. And for me, this was a lived reality that got out of, and apparently for your partner maybe was too. So I
mean, seriously, I could go for another hour, to be fair, but
so I
don't know how your listeners feel about that.
But I find this topic to be really interesting because we're at a point. I guess I've been bringing it up with like Professor. Have you followed this Professor Zhang stuff? Like,
like I've been too busy to follow it, but like it is on my
to-do
list to like follow.
It seems to be it posits itself as apolitical, and even looked vaguely leftist at first because of predictions about the Iran war and Trump. But it weirdly, Daniel Tutt wrote an article where he pointed out that like this guy seems to have been boosted in the algorithm as soon as TikTok got bought out, and he was unheard of before that. And it also seems like another one of these issues where like they're speaking about Palestinian issues and stuff in a way that appeals to leftists, but then you realize that he's like blaming the Freemasons and this weird Joseph Frank conspiracy shit's wild. Like it seems I can't find an origin of it before Candace Owens. But he's repeating that. There's like basic Judeo-Bolshevik stuff that somehow the bank, I mean, he's doing the whole the bank, he doesn't say the Jews, he says the bankers, but the bankers are the people who put Marx and Lenin up to it to create both capitalism as we know it and communism, which is it's classic. That's classic Judeo-Bolshevism. Like that's straight up like what the Nazis said. And people are beginning to catch on to it as like right-wing-esque conspiracy theories because he did an appearance on shows with Alexander Dugin and stuff like that. But at first it was just considered like apolitical. And I find right now that one of the things about modern influencer and internet culture is like, I meet people on the left who get temporarily sucked into these things all the time. So how do we deal with that now? Because it does seem like, you know, my concerns, like I mentioned, my concerns with Lacerdo and Rockhill are often less about, although I have problems with Lacerdo beyond this, less about Lacerdo and Rockhill and a lot more about like dumb uses of them by their fandom. But I am concerned this is just a general milieu now, and like your book is coming out at a time where like conspiracism's like the dominant mode of all politics in at least in America. I don't know if it's bad in the UK. I suspect it probably is, because it's as bad in Australia. And I'm always like, why the fuck are you getting our weird shit? You're not even in the same hemisphere as us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the answer to that is that there's a weird weeboo culture in the United Kingdom about the United States, and there are lots of English people who would rather be American, and unfortunately, I count myself among them. And so they were more than willing to sort of absorb like things from American politics and American culture. What was the other thing I was going to talk about? Because I think that we've touched on a number of things. Oh yes, it was a lot of people sort of responding to my book saying, "Oh, this should have been published in 2016." And
like when Kill Out Normies was high. Well, that was later.
Yeah.
Same time.
Yeah, and I think that it would have been less interesting then, because it would have obviously ignored a lot of the historical things that I'm able to cover in the book, that was sort of overlooked at the time. And then, I mean, it was just fandom culture. There's something about fandom something about fandom culture there that is sort of very important in all of this, but I'm sort of now losing the thread of it.
No, that's fair. I think the fandom issue is interesting, because I actually think conspiracy culture has always worked off of fandom logic, and the internet works off of fandom logic. Like if you like go back and like go into like conspiracy culture and the battles between like the guy who wrote Behold a Pale Horse, I can't remember his name, and then the
Gary something.
Yeah,
it was a Gary
who was a major influence on Alex Jones, but also like hated him. What was his name? Because I actually read this in the 90s. William Cooper. William Cooper.
There we go.
Bill Cooper, who also had ties to McVeigh.
I'm thinking of Gary Allen, who wrote None Dare Call It Conspiracy, which is like a more of a Birchright thing.
Right. Yeah. And yes, also what you see with what was Jones's initial brilliance was to combine Gary Allen Bircher conspiracism with a Bill Cooper neo-patriot conspiracism with just coast to coast AM generic conspiracy culture, which was not like, if you go back and listen to the coast to coast, it was not actually a coast to coast. What was it called actually? Art Bell, excuse me. So like because what Jones did was to politicize all that and tie Bircher conspiracies, Art Bell conspiracy, and the Cooper Patriot Movement conspiracies all together. But Cooper hated Jones, and Lemus Lid was involved in all this too, by the way, because he seemed to be everywhere. But go ahead.
Well, this is the classic thing that we've been talking about, of sort of like everyone that people assume who are all on the right together completely hate each other. And these are the things that in the histories are important to bear in mind. But it's also kind of like fascinating of how they end up hating each other rather than liking each other.
It's often minor differences of conspiracy theories, but also sometimes people feel like with Cooper, it was principle, but other times it's like someone stealing your monetary base. And I hate to say it, but it's like similar things happen in left influencerdom all the time.
Well, I was thinking about like what would Lacerda think about Rockhill?
Or the fact that like Rockhill has clearly broken with people he was initially sympathetic to, like the Midwestern Marx group, who he thinks are right wing, loonies. I know he thinks that because I've talked to students about it, but he was initially like working with them and publishing with them.
Yeah, totally.
And so these things happen, and I think one of the things I pointed out to people who always want to say, well, the left needs to answer these conspiracy and parapolitics stuff with more conspiracies, is I'm like, if you thought we split a lot on ideological issues, wait until you introduce us debating conspiracy unknowns and how much splitting we're going to do over that, because the right splits over that in ways that makes the left splitting look mild, but liberals don't believe it. Because one of the things that I will give rightists, they're actually better at popular frontism than leftists, because they hate each other, but they will drop it in public to get something done, and we won't. But they do hate each other in ways that like make some of our internal hate seem very mild.
Well, I mean, to get back to the Candace Owen things, of like her beef with the rest of the group is not anything just about Israel, but also just because she wants to seem like Charlie's BFF more than anyone else.
It's like a debate over it's a debate over the legacy of this scenario. And I mean, we're seeing this all over MAGA world, and I think leftists and liberals don't know what to do with it, because you also have like Marjorie Taylor Greene sounding progressive and like hanging out with like talking about supporting Ro Khanna doing some kind of weird inquest, even though she's no longer in office to do anything. At the same time, at the same token, like she's also still promoting Nick Fuentes. Like, and I'm just like, I think left wingers have a very, and particularly liberal influence one in America, have a very hard time dealing with this kind of level of like who's your enemy, who's a conspiracist, and even like, well, they kind of all are. And just because they might agree with you tactically, and you should maybe even take advantage of that tactically, you should never be fooled that these people are on your side. Unless they say they are. I mean, there's also ways of it going too far, like the people who like don't want to make any hay out of like Tucker turning on Trump over the war, and I'm like, that's actually objectively a good thing. And I'm like, that doesn't mean Tucker's on our side. Don't be dumb. It just means that this coalition is splintering, and you could take advantage of that. I want to ask you though, do you think these cultural Marxist conspiracies have a lot more leg life? Like, I don't know. Like, one of the things I've been wondering, I was talking to the Cold War cinema people yesterday, and we were talking about what we don't know if like all these Cold War conspiracy theories are going to last a whole lot longer after at least Gen X ages out of major political importance. What do you make of that? Because I go back and forth on whether or not it's going to go away.
It depends on whether we really grow out of the post-60s moment. I think that a lot of the debates in the United States, at least, are revolving around like splits or conflicts that really emerge from that period. And it's a matter of whether we are now entering or whether we're now in a new period that will shape the sorts of political organizations, the sort of political discussions we have for decades to come. And I don't know if it's necessarily easy to reduce that to like to generations itself. But I mean, it's hard. It's a hard question to answer because it is like a question about. It's a question about whether the institutions in our society will ultimately change. cultural Marxism has had its longevity because we still have universities, we still have kind of media companies, we still have certain groups in the way that they were formed in the post-war era, and they are sort of being deconstructed or being sold off in different ways, but they are still kind of the same. So it's a question of whether that changes, but also then you introduce other complicating factors into that, like the international spread of the cultural Marxism thesis to countries where the Frankfurt School never visited. The Frankfurt School's ideas have never really become like a very prominent part of the syllabi. And that's not just like the UK. That is India. That is Australia. That's Brazil, Argentina. I mean, all over the place where like cultural Marxism still sort of maintains a kind of resonance. And I mean, goodness knows whether that will continue to develop or it will die off. I mean, because we are in, I mean, certainly with the Iran war going on, in a very transitional period. But I will say that, I mean, ever since 2019, I mean, ever since the Boise conference, to be honest with you, I have been saying, let's go stop developing now, so I can confidently say this is the end point of it. I mean, it could just continue. I mean, it depends on what happens historically, but we are still stuck in a way of organizing society where the cultural Marxism idea remains a relevant explanation for what has happened. I don't know whether I don't know what future conspiracy theories would look like.
Yeah, I don't either. I mean, part of the problem is, I guess maybe this is the two places to end off on it. What are the trends that started happening in the late Greco, which is the European New Right organization in France? Is Guillaume Fay started this stuff on basically archaeofuturism that was also aimed at Islamism. And he started talking about Islamo-Bolshevism as opposed to Islamo-fascism. And what we've seen in this new weird hybrid moment with Trump is you got like Roy Chip in Texas explicitly calling Mamdani an Islamo-Marxist or Islamo-Bolshevik or whatever. And it is on cultural Marxist / Judeo-Bolshevik lines, but instead of Jews, it's Islamist. And what I find interesting is like while Alain de Benoit rejected this was a big like division in the French New Right. That this had a precursor in France. That like there were some in the French New Right who thought they could join up with like the French version of neoconservative anti-Islamism. But instead of it branding it Islamo-fascism, it's branding it Islamo-Bolshevism. And if you look at the way that this administration, whether or not you think they're fascist, and that is an infinite debate that I'm actually not all that concerned about. As I've talked with about recently, I agree with Timothy Snyder. Even if they were a fascist, they're so greedy they fuck it up. So and their outright grifting actually prevents their fascist stuff from working. So maybe that's a small weird ass blessing. But nonetheless, even if you think they are fascist, they've softened their rhetoric towards. They've made explicit fascistic references more than once. I don't know if they do it just to fuck with liberals, but like they've done it a lot. And so it makes sense to me that they can't scream Islamo-fascism. Also, that's too associated with the Bush administration and the people they supposedly hate. But they're going to try to bring back those neoconservative talking points by tying it into cultural Marxism and replacing Jews with Muslims. somewhat ironically, because because MAGA itself is also split about whether or not it's pro or anti-Jewish. See Tucker Carlson, etc. I mean, this is like, you go on X, you can watch this fight going back and forth forever. There's right wingers, calling each other this and that, and we're also in a moment where, like, as Sean brought up on your show, but I've also noted, the Israeli state is saying Greta Thunberg is a bigger anti-Semite than Nick Fuentes. Which I just feel like is an insult to Nick Fuentes, to be completely fair. So do you feel like that's where we see this might be going, as Islamo-Bolshevist conspiracies, replacing Islamofascism, or do you see because that does seem where it might have some sticking power, but it also, in this weird way, ties it back to, I mean, like, in this weird way, it's like a marriage of neoconservatism and paleoconservatism in a way that could only happen under Trump. So what do you make about that?
Yeah, I mean, like, the funny thing is that some of the uses of cultural Marxism that I see in the UK today are people who are on the right and are saying, listen, we shouldn't blame Muslims for our problems. The problem is the Jews, and it is the Jewish Frankfurt School that have ultimately produced the issues we see today. And so there is this still kind of strange tension between wanting to make cultural Marxism, well, an anti-Semitic idea, right? But, like, in certain countries where there is a tradition of demonizing and delegitimizing, like, Muslim involvement in civil society, there is this turn towards the idea of Islamo-leftism, or I mean, because it is certainly a French idea of Islamo-gauchism, I think, is the way you say. I think I butchered it, but you see that in the UK with the current successes of the Green Party, but also the founding of your party, where a number of sort of Muslim members of parliament were sort of reduced to this idea of the Gaza independence, despite the fact that their programs were actually broader than that. And it is sort of an attempt to, well, not deal with the fact that in the communities where people who can be called Islamo-leftists are represented, there are real issues, right? And as part of, like, not only this sort of attempt to discredit the pro-Palestinian solidarity movement, but also an attempt to discredit any kind of social democratic politics, which is what cultural Marxism, that was the function of cultural Marxism, as an idea of the kind of relatively mild liberal measures of affirmative action or political correctness are actually sort of Marxist ideas, and that's why we shouldn't believe in them or shouldn't pursue them, rather than whether they can actually have a successful effect.
Which was part of the Birchers too. The Birchers would accuse every civil rights activist of being Marxist, like. Yeah, and
which wasn't
were.
necessarily wrong, right? You know,
right.
I think Birchers kind of got it right of just sort of going, well, you're a Marxist, but I mean, the issue of the Birchers is they never went further and sort of, like, were asking about whether the social problems that these activists were dealing with were actual social problems. And this is what we continue to have with cultural Marxism and Islamo-leftism.
Yeah, I mean, it's, if you can talk about that, you don't have to talk about the fact that, like, Mamdani is popular, no matter, like, even if I don't think he's, like, radical enough or whatever, because he's actually tried to address issues. I mean, yes, the issue of Israel was made so important because of both Adams and Cuomo, but and the specific history of New York, but also like the mayor of New York doesn't really set any international policy except for like for like who a city invests in. That's like really the limit. And I find this kind of wild that we've ended up here because it does seem like in the American context, it is a weird bridge that you can rent all those like Islamo-fascist conspiracy theories from the neoconservatives over to this cultural Marxism stuff because they didn't care about that. But while also condemning the founders of neoconservatism as being secretly cultural Marxist at the same time, it's wild where it's at now. I mean, we can make fun of the easy, obvious stuff, like somehow the guy who hates jazz would have been the guy who wrote the music for the Beatles when he was really into Schoenberg. That's Adorno, by the way, for my listeners. But it's wild for me to like posit these other things. Well, we've been going for 3.5 hours, so I am going to let you go. It's late in the UK. But where can people find your work, AJ?
They can find it at like Verso Books, so you can just sort of search the Cultural Marxism Conspiracy. You can buy it there. I mean, if you're in the UK, please order it from either Resident Music in Brighton or City Books in Brighton or even Camptown Books in Brighton, because those are my local bookshops and record shops that I really love. And then on top of that, you can also find my work at the Anti-Capitalist Resistance website, which I often write for. And if you live in Brighton, please come to Anti-Capitalist Resistance events. Apparently, we're really cool and easygoing, which I don't know if that's necessarily a commendation, but come hang out with us is what I will essentially say.
All right. And for those of my listeners in the US, you can find the book. If you want to be more ethical about where you order it, you can get it from Powell's or Red Emma's, where they exist, or any of those places. It is also available from Verso directly. And if you want none of those, yes, you can go to the obvious big box stores and or big giant evil corporations.
I think it is available. Target has listed it, so if you want to go to Target, it is a possibility.
Which, you know, I guess is minimally evil. Sometime I'm gonna find out that Powell's is like secretly funding genocide somewhere. I don't even know one exists or something. And I'm gonna have to feel bad about that. But sorry, Powell's. I don't think that's true, guys. It just feels like I can't. Whatever people are like, suggest an ethical place to buy a book, and I'm like, I don't know, man. Like I try.
Yeah. Well, I used to spend a lot of time in Powell's because I used to live in Portland. I lived in Portland for a couple of years, so the Powell's Cafe was one of my favorite places to hang out because it's a great bookstore.
It's a giant bookstore. I will say, there are two bookstores that I tell people that you kind of need to go into if you ever get a chance. And one's the Strand in New York, and the other one is Powell's in Portland. As far as I'm concerned, it's the only reason to go to Portland. I don't actually feel that way, but I kind of do.
There are great rose gardens.
That's true. There are, and there's some cool cafes. There's a couple of dive bars. Were you living in Portland when we met?
No, I was living in London, Ontario at that point, but it was about a year or two after I had left Portland.
Okay.
I know certain aspects of Boise that reminded me out of it. I mean, I think that as soon as you're out west, like the center parts of any city sort of feels somewhat the same. Like there are cool dive bars and sort of cool people hanging around.
Yeah.
Even if it's not necessarily citywide.
No, Boise is an interesting little town. I will say. Well, I mean, it's not little; it's kind of growing gangbusters. But it is a weird I mean, it's a normal progressivist shitty in a state that is the most reactionary state in the, even more than Texas. Like, you don't hear about Idaho as much, but Idaho is more conservative than Texas or Mississippi or Alabama. Or Utah, or you know, it's there's parts of Idaho that I don't feel comfortable driving in at night without a gun. And so but Boise's fine. Boise's great.
It's where Patrick. It's where Patrick still lives, presumably. Yep. I think I haven't spoken to him for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. Patrick is still out there, I think. We still talk. He's still involved in the show. Patrick, for those of you who don't know, used to be. He was when I wanted to replace me at Pop the Left. He was my chosen successor. He also had the unfortune of transcribing every Pop the Left episode that existed before it was rebooted in 2019, which sounds like a lot, but there's actually only 10 episodes, and us going, oh, I was kind of dumb in 2012. I mean, it's funny because if you read those transcripts, or even like if people want to, I guess I'll plug my show. If you subscribe to my Patreon, you can find all these archives, including although 3 of the original run Pop the Left shows are not available anywhere. I cannot find anyone who has them archived either. But most of them are available. And my thing, you can listen to me talk about the left in the early teens. And what is weird about that is what we're actually talking about is the left in the aughts in the 1990s. Because like people still care about John Saracen and stuff in 2012. And it is crazy how like 2 years after Occupy, everything that we talked about in those shows seems completely superfluous. like even by the time we were done, it's like none of that stuff matters anymore. We're now dealing with whatever the fuck this Bernie Sanders phenomenon is. So Patrick goes back to, that's how we know each other. You and Patrick did a show together for a while, right?
Yeah, no, but Patrick and I did we met at the Boise conference because Patrick was working at the time as a janitor at Boise State University.
Yeah, I believe so.
And he managed to get along to a couple of the sessions at the Jordan Peterson conference that both you and I went to, and Patrick and I had a chat. We became Facebook friends, and he sent out a post one day about saying people should do a podcast about all of the radical thinkers series that Verso does, and like have discussions about whether they're any good or not. And we did that for basically 2 series, which is basically like, I mean, what we did that, like 22, 24 books. And then just like life got in the way, which I mean, like is what happens with a lot of podcast projects that are based on like a certain basis. I mean, even Sufjan Stevens, who sort of wanted to do a series of albums about every state, and he managed.
He got through 2 of them.
So in comparison,
Michigan and Illinois, that's it.
So I mean, like the Radical Thinker podcast was just kind of like me, Patrick, Donald Parkinson, another person from Cosmonaut whose name I'm forgetting.
Was it Parker?
Yeah, it was Parker, I think. We went through a bunch of them, and like, if you read my book and then re-listen to a lot of the conversations that we had, you can kind of hear the influence that had, because I'm sort of writing a lot of the stuff that ended up being in the book while we were recording that podcast. So if you want to, one day you were interviewed twice, I think.
Yeah, I was interviewed once for Althusser, and once
I don't
for
want it for
Adorno.
Baudrillard. Yeah.
No, no, I take that back. I wasn't upset. It was Baudrillard and Adorno to interview for. Because I was talking about how I both love and hate Minima Moralia. And then I talked about like my bizarro relationship with Baudrillard, who I do not think is a right winger, but I think a lot of people who like him are, even if they don't know it. It was a fun show. I think it's still available. People should look it up and check it out. Our sign off, and then we really will be done. I did not realize that you were the same A.J. Woods as the Verso show A.J. Woods until I messaged you on out of nowhere, as if I did not know you, and you reminded me that you were the same person, and I was like, but you sound so much more British than you used to. I mean, you always sounded British. I knew you were British when I met you, but like you sound more British now, and then you obviously you're back home, so it makes sense. Like
no, but because at the time I was still kind of like the weird American Canadian AJ, whereas now I've lived back in the UK for like 3 years now, so I'm surrounded by these British people, and it's maddening. I'm like, where are some of the? I mean, thankfully I'm married to an American, but I need to accumulate more Americans and Canadians in my inner circle while I'm living here, I think.
Yeah, there's a lot of them there, even still, even though I'm like, what are you doing? The UK, I mean, to be fair, when I was saying this, the United States also doesn't really have an economy anymore. So like, it's a little bit different to make this joke now. Yeah, so I didn't realize that you were the same A.J. Woods. I was just like, oh, I know the guy who wrote this book. Oh, we've talked about this stuff before.
What I mean, and some like the first engagements with this was like the sectarian review episode that you did.
Oh yeah, yes, that was for.
And that is like years and years ago. Like that's 2017 at that point.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
But because early on you were the only person who had like been doing podcasts about this, and then the subsequent years that there was a lot more coverage of it, but you were the only person who was on any podcast talking about this.
Oh yeah, no, because what I remember what it was is Danny Anderson of the Sectarian Review, which was weirdly a left-wing Christian podcast, interestingly enough.
No, I loved that podcast. It was great.
He had me come on and talk about like all the buzzwords that were coming out of at the time Coolette, and I went through like the William Lynn stuff, and then even before that, somebody had asked me to go into the rational core of paleoconservative stuff for systematic redness, so I did an episode with the Moke Sahu in I think it was 2014, it may have been 2013. On what the truth and lies of cultural Marxism, like so I did several shows on it, and you're right, nobody was talking about it. People thought it was weird to even address it. I think Martin J had done like a NPR thing about the cultural Marxist conspiracies, and also how sometimes they showed up on the left because he was talking about Castro blaming Adorno for something. But in general, other than that one appearance by Martin J on a liberal show, no one was talking about it. And I was like, we have to have an answer to this, because I started seeing it in Breitbart. I'm like, this is showing up everywhere. I used to associate it with like Bircher circles, very talking mag circles, very marginal circles, but now it's ubiquitous, and it's not just on the alt-right, it's like in the general Zet guys. And it took forever to get the left to respond to it, so I'm glad you wrote the book. I'm glad it's so well documented. Thank you for that.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you. I mean, like, it was nice to hang out with someone at the conference who understood what I was talking about, and also someone who I'm able to sort of like nerd out about, like, sort of the weird splits within the right with, because I think that outside of people like you and also people who sort of study it a lot, like there is a tendency to sort of conflate the right or sort of not be interested in those histories. And so being able to dig into that is actually really satisfying.
Yeah, my favorite weird deep dive that I haven't ever gone into was like the temporary split when the alt-right split and the alt-right name actually went to a different group than Richard Spencer's group, who went by Radix, and only with Hillary Clinton used the alt-right in her list of deplorable speech did Spencer get the alt-right back as a moniker. My other favorite thing right now is a lot of people are saying that Spencer was a Southern Poverty Law Center plant, which I'm like, there's no evidence for that. He was a member of the National Policy Institute. If you don't know the National Policy Institute, that sounds innocuous. It's actually a neo-Nazi organization. So, whatever. I mean, who knows? I don't know.
We're having very similar debates in the UK here right now of like Nigel Farage being like controlled opposition. That accusation not only coming from Elon Musk, but various people who are organizing on the right now. And so it's actually quite fascinating to be like studying the British right, because they're sort of going through a similar period to what was happening to the US alt-right in like the first Trump administration. And it'll be interesting to see how that then feeds into like a Farage government, which I would like to say is not inevitable, but seems actually quite likely in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I was about to say, I mean, somehow Macron has held off, and maybe Mélenchon's going to come from behind after the last municipal rounds. But I've also been like, it looks like the Le Penite movement, although not herself because she can't run now, is going to dominate in France. And I've also been like, it looks like Reform is going to dominate in the UK because, I mean, the Starmer administration's been like, I thought the SPD and the Greens in Germany were deeply embarrassing and discrediting, but like, to use an American phrase of my generation, Labor has now gone hold my beer. Let's oversee stuff like the undoing of trial by jury, and stuff that goes all the way back to the fucking Magna Carta. So,
that no one asks for, right? Like no one is saying, can we get rid of jury trials? There is no like organic demand for that among the British population. It's just sort of something that they have done because they're fucking dorks and they're like technocrats, and they're like, well, actually, if we get rid of this, then maybe like prosecutions can happen faster, and we can see that in like media interviews of sort of saying, oh no, Labour is tough on crime because like we've had these much more this vast increase of people going to prison, without actually sort of like fixing the prison system or even like questioning what the prison system in the UK is even like.
No, yeah, what we make fun of you here for is Keir Starmer kicked up something that was already done with the Tories, which is putting people in jail for social media posts. And that's what we always comment on. I mean, I think it's overstated, frankly, but like, you can get Americans both left and right all honoring about free speech issues. I do appreciate this one thing about where the British Labour has gone, and that is it does sometimes make me feel like the British left has actually made me feel slightly better about the American left, but only slightly. And to give my British listeners a break, I think we are, as far as like, you guys were really topping us off on this acceleration towards the bottom, but like in the last 2 years, we've bypassed you. We just have a lot more to fall from. Then
give us a second chance. We will catch up, I think.
Well, I mean, under Farage government, it's gonna be interesting. I mean, if people thought that Boris Johnson was Trump-esque, wait till they see Nigel Farage. But anyway, thank you so much, AJ. Thank you for coming on. People should check out your old show. They should check out the book. They share your stuff for for anti-capitalist resistance. And you know what? They should even check out Brighton if they're ever in the UK, I guess. I hear it's lovely.
It's a nice city, yeah. It's nice to be beside the seaside, as the
Yeah.
old song goes.
I'm kind of surprised that anything isn't beside the sea. But then again, as an American, I have a different scale of space.
Yeah. No, I do remember moving to Portland and being like, oh, that's cool, it's near the sea, but then having to do like the 3-hour journey to the sea, and going, oh, actually, no, America is fucking massive.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, like, I always say I grew up on the East Coast, and I did. I grew up 2.5 hours away from the ocean, which is for an American short.
Because
I live in Utah now, and to get out of we're actually weirdly, we're a very urbanized state because you can't really live in most of Utah is actually hostile to all life, and I'm not really exaggerating. And because it's high plains desert, and but once you get out of the immediate valley area where there's like a cluster of 7 cities, the nearest city is 5 hours away, and it's like Las Vegas, and then it's Boise, and you drive to Boise, and I'm like, yeah, and you know what? This took me longer than driving from London to the back end of Scotland would take, and I consider this nearby. So whenever I talk to Brits, I always have to remind, like, we have a completely different scale of space.
No, I have adapted to like the American scale over time, and it is sort of like weird to sort of turn back to British mode, where actually like 50 miles makes a huge amount of difference.
Yeah, I mean, it is wild to me because I've always been like, the entirety of the UK is like the size of like 3 southern states. It's like a cluster, like Alabama, Mississippi. I don't even think it's that big. Like it's
it could fit inside Mississippi. Well, it could fit inside Texas. I know that.
It definitely. But like, okay, like half of Europe can fit inside Texas. But like, I mean, the other thing is, I'm like, if you don't include Eastern Europe and you're only talking about Western Europe, our country is bigger than your region. So anyway. That note, and those basic geographic facts being disputed with, we're going to end the show after 4 hours. Thank you so much, AJ.
Okay. Thank you very much for having me on. Yeah.
All right.
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Ooh.